She showed up to a war zone carrying a camera and a press badge. They handed her a water bottle and pointed her toward the media tent. Nobody handed her a rifle. Nobody thought she needed one. That was their first mistake. 3 days later, in a valley that didn't appear on any civilian map, Ranger Team 412 walked into the worst ambush of their careers. 11 enemy fighters, 11 positions, 11 angles of death closing in from every ridge. 11 shots fired, 11 targets down, one shooter. The woman they told to stay behind the wire. If you're new here, subscribe now and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The helicopter came in low over the ridge, bleeding altitude the way sick men bleed sweat, fast, steady, and without ceremony. Mia Torres sat wedged between a supply crate and the door gunner's seat, her camera bag pressed against her knees, her body absorbing the rattling vibrations of the old Chinook like she'd done it 100 times before. Outside the porthole window, the Afghan highlands threw long shadows across a landscape the color of dried bone. The mountains didn't care who was looking at them. They never did. She'd been in the air for 4 hours. Before that, a military transport from Bagram. Before that, a commercial flight from Dulles that she'd almost missed because she'd been standing outside the terminal smoking a cigarette she didn't even want, staring at the taxis like they might tell her something useful. They didn't. She boarded anyway. The Chinook lurched sideways in a gust, and the door gunner, a kid who couldn't have been older than 22, grabbed the mount with practiced hands and didn't even flinch. Mia noticed that. She noticed the way his grip tightened before the gust hit, not after. Someone had trained him to read the wind. She looked back out the window. Black Ridge Forward Operating Base materialized out of the dust like something assembled from spare parts and stubbornness. Corrugated metal roofing. Sandbag walls stacked 4 feet high and reinforced with timber. Comm arrays on the north perimeter. Antennas bristling against the sky. A pair of MRAPs sat outside the motor pool, one with a cracked windshield that hadn't been replaced. Fuel drums near the eastern gate. 2 rangers on the gate, rifles slung but hands loose, watching the helicopter come down with the casual alertness of men who'd been doing this long enough to look relaxed without actually being relaxed. Mia cataloged it all before the skids touched dirt. She wasn't sure why she still did that. Old habit, maybe. The kind that didn't go away just because you'd signed the discharge papers and walked out the gate and told yourself you were done. The ramp dropped. Heat punched her in the face, dry, scalding, the kind of heat that lived at altitude and meant business. She shouldered her camera bag, grabbed her pack, and walked down into the dust. A sergeant met her at the edge of the landing zone. Young, sunburned, with the squinting expression of a man perpetually annoyed by something he couldn't quite name. "Torres?" he said, looking at his clipboard. "Yeah." "Press credential?" She handed him the laminated card. He studied it for a moment. Mia Torres, freelance photojournalist, Associated Press authorization, then handed it back without changing his expression. "Media tent's over there. Briefing tomorrow at 0600. You stay inside the wire unless a handler is with you. Questions?" "Where do I drop my gear?" "Media tent," he said again, and walked away. Mia watched him go. Then she looked around the base, slowly, methodically, the way a person reads a room before they sit down in it. She identified the duty officer's position, the comm building, the armory. The gap in the sandbag wall near the south perimeter, patched with timber that didn't quite fit. The angle of the mountains to the north, the way the ridgeline created a natural funnel toward the eastern approach. She picked up her pack and walked toward the media tent. Captain Adrian Cross was at the base commander's briefing table when word came down about the embedded journalist. He didn't look up from the terrain map immediately. He was studying the Ashen Valley route, a 15-kilometer passage through mountain terrain that was supposedly cleared but that his gut told him was anything but. "Press?" he said. "Single. Freelance photographer. AP credentials, cleared by brigade." Sergeant Hooper set the paperwork on the corner of the table. "Name's Torres. Man or woman?" "Woman, sir." Cross looked up at that. Not out of surprise, he'd worked with female correspondents before, but because something about Hooper's tone suggested the sergeant thought it was notable enough to mention. "She cause a problem yet?" "No, sir. Just landed." "Then she's not our problem yet." He went back to the map. "Make sure she understands the ground rules. Anything beyond the wire, she goes with a handler, non-negotiable." "Understood." Cross traced his finger along the valley route. 15 kilometers. One road through, no viable alternate. Cliff faces on both sides for the first 6 clicks, then open terrain that opened the convoy to observation from 3 different elevation lines simultaneously. The mission was straightforward. Escort a medical supply convoy from Black Ridge to Forward Support Point Kilo. Humanitarian cargo, time sensitive. The Rangers had run this route twice before without contact. He didn't like running the same route 3 times. He never did. Sir? Hooper was still standing there. What? She's already been to the motor pool. Cross looked up again. The journalist? Yes, sir. One of the mechanics found her walking the perimeter of the vehicle bay. Said she was taking pictures. Of the MRAPs? Of the mountains, sir. She was standing next to the bay, but she was shooting west, toward the ridgeline. Cross held Hooper's eyes for a moment. Is that unusual for a photographer? No, sir. I guess not. Hooper hesitated. Just seemed like she was paying more attention to the terrain than to the vehicles. Cross looked back at his map. Keep an eye on her. Mia met the Rangers of Team 412 at Chow that evening. There were 11 of them, plus Cross and his 2 senior NCOs. They sat at the long tables in the DFAC, the dining facility, which was really just a prefab building with strip lighting and the persistent smell of diesel fuel. And they did what soldiers always did when a journalist showed up. They put on a show. It wasn't malicious. It rarely was. It was just the reflex, the posturing, the jokes made slightly louder than necessary, the sidelong glances to see if the press was watching. She was watching. That was technically her job. Corporal Danny Walsh was the loudest. Mid-20s, from somewhere in Texas, with a jaw like a cinder block and a grin that belonged on a recruitment poster. He'd been showing off since she walked in, and he wasn't subtle about it. So what's the story? He said from across the table, leaning back with his fork in his hand. You following us out on the convoy tomorrow? If Captain Cross approves it, she said, he'll approve it. Walsh grinned at the man next to him. Specialist Garrett, quieter, with dark eyes that tracked everything. Command loves the press coverage, makes the brass feel good about themselves. Danny, Garrett said quietly. Not a reprimand, just a temperature check. Walsh ignored it. You ever been on a convoy before? Out in actual country, not just the fob? A few times. Where? Iraq, Helmand, South Sudan. She cut a piece of chicken that had given up the fight sometime around the 2nd hour of cooking. Kandahar once, but that one was short. Walsh blinked. Kandahar. He recalibrated slightly. She could see it happen, the minor adjustment behind his eyes. But he rallied. Still, though, tomorrow's pretty routine, humanitarian run. You'll probably get some good shots of us being, humanitarian. He grinned again. I'll manage. She ate. Around her, the conversation moved to other things. The football scores. Someone's wife back in Georgia. A bet about whether the FOB's generator would last the winter. Normal things. Human things. She listened without appearing to listen, which was a skill that served her as well as any other she'd ever developed. She was halfway through her coffee when she caught Cross looking at her from the other end of the table. Not the way Walsh looked at her. Not assessing or performing, just watching. The way a man looks at something that doesn't quite add up yet. She held his gaze for a second, then looked back at her cup. That night, she sat on the sandbag wall near the south perimeter and reviewed her shots from the day. The screen on her camera glowed in the darkness. Technically, she wasn't supposed to be out of the media tent after 2200, but the guard who walked past had clocked her sitting there, decided she wasn't a threat, and kept walking. She scrolled through the images. The mountains to the west, the eastern ridgeline, the road that disappeared into the valley. She'd taken maybe 30 shots that afternoon, most of them tactical in nature, terrain, elevation lines, the shape of the cliffs, and maybe 5 or 6 that could actually be called journalism. She paused on one image. The gap in the western ridge, maybe 4 kilometers from the FOB, where a natural shelf jutted out from the cliff face at roughly 400 meters elevation. Good concealment from below. Good sightline down into the approach road. She stared at it for a while. Then she closed the camera and went back to her tent. The morning of the convoy launch, Cross gathered his team at the vehicle bay at 0530. The MRAPs were staged and loaded, 3 vehicles carrying the humanitarian supply crates, plus the command vehicle up front. The Rangers were in full kit, plate carriers, helmets, radios checked and tested. The convoy medic, PFC Okafor, had his aid bag mounted and ready. The whole thing had the organized, deliberate feel of a unit that had done this enough times to not waste motion. Mia showed up at 0540 with her camera bag and her pack. Walsh looked at her and then looked at Cross. "She's on the convoy," Cross said, before Walsh could say anything. He looked at Mia. "You ride in the command vehicle. You stay in the vehicle unless I tell you otherwise. If shooting starts, you get down and you stay down. You clear on that?" "Clear," she said. "You clear on that, or are you going to tell me about your Kandahar experience?" "Clear, Captain." He held her eyes for a moment. Something in his expression wasn't hostile. It was the opposite of hostile. He was looking for something. She wasn't sure what he found. "Mount up," he said to the team. The convoy pulled out at 0600 as scheduled. The road into Ashen Valley was everything the terrain map had promised, and nothing it could properly communicate. You could look at a topographic overlay and understand intellectually that the canyon walls rose to 300 meters on each side, and that the road through was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. You could read the elevation data and know that the first 6 kilometers were essentially a shooting gallery. High ground on both sides, limited egress, one way in and one way out. Knowing it and being inside it were different things. The walls of red-brown rock rose around them as the convoy pushed deeper into the valley, the sound of the engines bouncing back from the cliff faces in flat directional echoes. The morning light hadn't reached the valley floor yet. They were moving through gray shadow, the sun somewhere above the ridgeline, but not yet visible from down here. Mia sat in the command vehicle's rear compartment, next to the radio operator, a young ranger named Delgado, who had the calm, slightly distant expression of someone perpetually monitoring 3 frequencies at once. Her camera was in her lap. She wasn't shooting. She was watching the road ahead through the bulletproof glass. At kilometer 3, she said, "Stop the vehicle." Cross, in the front passenger seat, turned around. "What?" "The rock's on the right ridge, about 250 meters up." She kept her eyes on the cliff face. "There's a section that's been disturbed. Fresh scree. Looks like it slid recently. Maybe last 12 hours. Cross looked at her. "Rock slides happen," Delgado said carefully. "That's not a rock slide pattern. The scree trail runs vertically. Rock slides spread laterally." She finally looked at Cross. Something moved up there. Something heavy enough to displace that much material. A long pause. The convoy had slowed but not stopped. Through the windshield, the valley stretched ahead, quiet and sun-shadowed. "You shoot terrain photographs," Cross said slowly. It wasn't really a question. "I shoot what I see." Cross held her eyes for another 2 seconds. Then he keyed his radio. "Black Horse elements, this is 6. All vehicles reduce speed, maintain spacing. Command is doing a visual on the north ridge at grid." He read off the coordinates. "Weapons up. Report anything that doesn't look right. Break. All elements, acknowledge." The acknowledgements came back in order down the net. Walsh's voice came on last from the 3rd vehicle. 6, this is 4. What are we looking for?" "Anything that looks like it's been moved recently," Cross said. "Rock, debris, anything disturbed. And Walsh?" "Yeah." "Don't drive like you're in a hurry." The convoy moved forward. At kilometer 4.7, the world came apart. The first explosion detonated under the lead vehicle. Not a massive IED, but shaped charges placed to disable rather than destroy, because someone had wanted the convoy alive long enough to be overwhelmed. The MRAP bucked upward at the front end and came back down canted at a 20-degree angle, engine dead, right front wheel blown off at the axle. Before the dust from the first blast had finished rising, the ridge lit up. Mia had her hand on the door handle before her brain fully processed the sound. Instinct. Old instinct. The kind you don't train out of yourself, you just bury. She forced herself to stay in the vehicle. Cross was already on the radio, voice sharp and controlled. "Contact, contact, contact. Black Horse elements. We have IED strike on Vehicle 1, taking small arms from the north ridge. All elements return fire. Find cover. Find cover. Delgado, get me brigade. I've got nothing, sir. We've lost comms. The ridge is blocking. We need height." Gunfire hammered against the vehicle's armor plating. A harsh, rhythmic clang like someone beating a steel drum with a hammer. Someone outside screamed. Not a pain scream, a rage scream. The kind soldiers make when they charge instead of run. Mia looked out the side window. The kill zone was textbook. Enemy positions on the northern ridge at approximately 250 and 300 meters elevation, using the natural ledges for cover. More fire from the southern cliff face, lighter, suppressive, designed to keep heads down while the main element on the north worked. The convoy was strung out across 40 meters of road with a disabled vehicle blocking forward movement and nothing but cliff wall behind. No exit, no high ground, no comms. She had filed this problem away before she was 20 years old. She hadn't expected to need it again. Cross was out of the vehicle, crouched behind the hood with his rifle up, coordinating the team's return fire. Walsh's vehicle had its occupants deployed. She could see them through the dust and smoke. Rangers using the MRAP as cover, returning fire upslope at muzzle flashes they could barely see. Someone was doing tourniquet work on a man who'd been outside Vehicle 1 when the IED hit. Then the enemy shifted. A rocket-propelled grenade screamed in from the northern ridge and hit the second vehicle's rear quarter. Not a direct hit, maybe 15 meters short, but the blast pressure shattered Mia's window and flung her against the door. She hit the floor, ears screaming, and lay there for 2 full seconds in the ringing aftermath. 2 seconds. She got up. Her camera was on the floor. The lens had cracked, not shattered, cracked. A diagonal fracture across the front element that would ruin every shot. She looked at it for a moment. Outside, Team 412's marksman, Specialist Kavanaugh, the team's designated sharpshooter, was slumped against the front wheel of Vehicle 2, not moving. His SRS rifle was on the ground beside him. She opened the door and got out. The noise was immense. Rifle fire, RPG concussion still echoing off the cliff walls, men shouting in clipped military bursts, dust everywhere, thick enough to chew. She moved in a low crouch along the passenger side of the command vehicle, staying below the roofline, until she reached the front bumper. Kavanaugh was alive. She could see his chest moving, but he had a head wound that had put him down, and he wasn't getting back up anytime soon. The SRS was a Gen 2 Accuracy International chassis, 338 La Pua. She'd trained on that exact platform for 2 years. She picked it up, checked the magazine. 4 rounds remaining, plus 1 in the chamber. Checked the scope. The Atakiar had taken a hit. The turret cap was cracked, but the reticle looked intact. She moved around the rear of Vehicle 2, past a ranger who almost shot her before he registered she wasn't the enemy, and found the angle she needed. A diagonal across the road to a shelf of rock that rose about a meter above the road surface, giving her a partial elevation advantage on the closer of the 2 northern ridge positions. Walsh appeared at her shoulder from nowhere. He grabbed her arm. "What the hell are you—" She shrugged him off and settled behind the rifle. "Lady, you need to get back in the— You need to get your head down," she said, and she heard her own voice from somewhere distant, flat and precise, and the tone of it, not panicked, not performing, just operational, made him stop talking. She found the first target in the scope, 312 meters, adjusting for the upslope angle, subtract 8% for the cosine. Wind was pushing left to right at roughly 8 knots, mild for this elevation. She dialed 2 MOA right, held a half mil for the elevation, and let out half a breath. Walsh was watching her. She could feel it. She was aware of everything. The temperature of the rifle stock against her cheek, the smell of propellant on the barrel from Kavanaugh's earlier shots, the way the shadows fell across the north ridge and half concealed the position she was aiming at. She found the target. She fired. The recoil came back through her shoulder the way an old familiar thing comes back, something you recognize in your body before your mind catches up. 300 meters away. On the north ridge, the muzzle flash from one enemy position went permanently dark. Walsh made a sound. She couldn't interpret it. She was already acquiring the next target. "Mother of God," he said. She was already firing. The second shot took 4 seconds from the first. The third came 6 seconds after that. She was working the positions in order of threat priority. The RPG gunner first, then the fire team directing the southern suppression, then the observation post at the high point of the north ridge that was feeding range data to the rest of the element. Methodical. Sequenced. The way you cleared a problem when the problem had geometry. Walsh had stopped talking entirely. He was crouched behind the rock shelf to her left, his own rifle up, but he wasn't firing. He was watching her work. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anything that wasn't inside that scope. 6. This is Sergeant Hooper. We've got a shooter on our side. Unknown position. North Ridge taking casualties. Cross's voice cut back immediately. Hooper, that's our side. Stand by. She heard Cross over the ambient noise. He was close, maybe 15 meters behind her, working his way up the road using the vehicle hulks as cover. She didn't turn. She found the fourth position, made the wind correction, and fired. 4 down. The fire from the North Ridge degraded noticeably. Not stopped, there were still positions active. But the rhythm of it broke, became hesitant. When you start losing people without knowing where it's coming from, you stop being aggressive. You start looking for cover instead of pressing the attack. That hesitation bought the Rangers on the valley floor 30 seconds. 30 seconds in a firefight is a long time. Cross slid in beside her. He was breathing hard, a shallow cut above his left eye from something she hadn't seen happen. His rifle held low. He looked at the North Ridge. He looked at her. He said nothing. She fired again. "Where'd you learn that?" he said, not accusatory, not amazed, just asking, like he already knew the answer and wanted to hear how she'd phrase it. "Later," she said. She worked the bolt. Last round in the magazine. "I'm going dry," she said. "I need more." Kavanaugh's kit, already stripped it. This is all he had staged. She pulled back from the scope and looked at him directly for the first time since she'd picked up the rifle. "I need to reposition. The angle's compromised. They're adjusting to the sound. Another 60 seconds, and they'll have me located." Cross stared at her. In the background, his team was moving. She could hear Hooper shouting, vehicles repositioning, someone getting Kavanaugh onto a litter. "You're a journalist," Cross said. "I was." She grabbed the rifle, grabbed Kavanaugh's remaining spare mag from the kit she'd already stripped, and moved. Well, she repositioned to the rear of Vehicle 3, using the bulk of the MRAP to break her silhouette against the cliff wall, then moved laterally until she found an angle on the higher of the 2 northern positions, the one that had been feeding spotting data. The spotter was good. She could tell by the way he'd been working, moving every 30 to 45 seconds, never staying in one spot long enough to be fixed, using the natural rock formations to break his outline. He'd been doing this for a while. She settled into a prone position, loaded the fresh magazine, and waited. He'd moved to the left next. The terrain funneled him left. The ledge narrowed to the right, and he'd already used the right side twice. She tracked left of his last position and waited. 17 seconds. He moved. She fired before he'd fully settled. 6 down. The northern ridge went almost quiet. There was still fire from the southern cliff, lighter weapons, AKs by the sound of them, suppressive rather than targeted. And she could hear the deep, resonant thump of an RPG being loaded somewhere to the northeast, out of her current sightline. But the coordinated, organized pressure from the north had collapsed. Walsh appeared at her side again. This time he didn't grab her arm. "Garrett's hit," he said. "Not bad, but he's out of the fight. We've still got the south position and something behind us, northeast corner of the valley, and we've got 2 vehicles down. Can the third move? Yeah. Get your wounded in it and get it turned around. You need to pull back 50 meters to the bend in the road. The cliff angle will cut off the southern fire arc." Walsh blinked. "You're giving tactical." "Walsh," she held his eyes. 50 meters. The bend in the road. Do it now." He did it. She was aware in some small and buried part of her mind that a line had just been crossed. Not the line of picking up the rifle, but the line of directing the tactical response. That was a different thing. She wasn't sure how she felt about it, and she didn't have time to find out. Cross materialized again. He had that quality, appearing suddenly without seeming to rush. "South position," she said to him. "Light weapons, likely 6 to 8 shooters. They're suppressing, not assaulting. They're waiting for the northeast element to come in behind us. That's the main force." "How do you know?" "Because the south fire has been consistent and non-advancing for 7 minutes. If they were the main effort, they'd have moved by now." She looked at him. "The northeast element is the one that scares me. I can't get eyes on it from here." Cross keyed his radio. He'd managed to get partial comms through, not brigade, but the FOB, enough to report contact and request QRF. The quick reaction force would be 30 to 45 minutes, minimum. They had 7 rounds between them and the northeast. "What do you need?" he said. She thought about it for 3 seconds. "Height," she said. "I need to get above the south position. There's a shelf on the western cliff, maybe 30 meters up. I saw it on my approach yesterday. If I can get to that elevation, I can range the south shooters and I'll have a sight line into the northeast approach. That shelf is 100 meters behind us. Yes. You'd be isolated. Yes. If the northeast element gets into the valley, you're cut off. I know. She looked at him. But if the northeast element gets into the valley while your team is pinned in this kill zone, you're done. This is the only play that gives you a margin. Cross was quiet for a moment. Behind him, she could hear his team working, voices tight and controlled, men doing the things trained men do when trained men are under fire. Efficient. Professional. Scared in the way that made them sharper rather than slower. Can you make that climb with a rifle? I made harder climbs with heavier equipment. He held her eyes for a long moment. She could see him calculating, not just the tactical math, but something else. The larger question of who she was and why she moved like this, and what it meant that she'd walked into his base with a press credential and was now discussing tactical positioning like a staff officer. Go, he said. She went. The climb took 11 minutes. The shelf was real. She'd spotted it the previous afternoon from the motor pool, that same instinct cataloging the terrain before she'd consciously decided to look for it. It was a natural limestone ledge, roughly 4 meters wide and maybe 8 meters deep, where the cliff face had fractured and left a recessed platform about 30 meters above the valley floor. Accessible via a crack in the rock that ran diagonally from the road level, narrow, uneven, the kind of route a climber would call moderate and a soldier would call workable. She climbed it carrying the SRS slung across her back, using both hands on the rock, moving fast because fast was safer than careful when you were this exposed. Her hands found holds automatically. Her boots found friction. Somewhere in the back of her head, a voice told her that she was doing this wrong, that she should have stayed in the vehicle and kept her head down and let the trained soldiers handle the trained soldier problems. She told the voice to shut up and kept climbing. The ledge, when she reached it, was better than she'd hoped. The overhang above provided partial concealment from above, and the ledge itself was deep enough that she could set up a few meters back from the edge and have the rock face as a backstop, limiting her signature. She low-crawled to the edge and looked down. The valley below resolved into clarity. She could see everything. The 3 ranger vehicles, one disabled, one partially mobile, the third repositioned per her instruction around the road bend. The spread of her rangers using the vehicle hulks and natural rock features for cover. Hooper and Walsh running what looked like a coordinated return fire rotation on the southern cliff. Cavanaugh on a litter near the bend. Garrett, she counted heads, sitting up, so not as bad as Walsh had made it sound. She looked northeast. She found them. The enemy's second element was moving along a dry riverbed that ran parallel to the main valley, approximately 600 meters out. 30, maybe 35 fighters. Moving in 2 columns, using the riverbed's banks for cover, advancing toward the valley opening at a pace that suggested they'd be in effective range in 12 to 15 minutes. 30 fighters against 9 mobile rangers. With no comms to brigade. She looked at her magazine. 11 rounds left. She made the calculation the way she used to make every calculation, quickly, clinically, without flinching from the answer. 11 rounds would not stop 30 fighters, but 11 rounds, placed correctly, would delay them, complicate their movement, force them to slow and reorganize. And if the Rangers could hold the valley entrance for 20 minutes instead of 12, she set up behind the rifle. Her first shot into the advancing column traveled 640 meters. She'd ranged it off the largest rock formation in the riverbed, a 2-meter boulder she'd spotted on her approach, and walked the distance backward from there. 640. At that range, Poit 338 La Pua dropped significantly. She dialed up the elevation, adjusted for the quartering crosswind that moved differently at this altitude than it did on the valley floor. She found the lead element of the column. She identified the figure who was moving with the particular purposefulness of someone giving orders, not a man carrying a weapon, but a man directing men carrying weapons. Slight difference in carriage, slight difference in where the eyes went. She fired. The column stopped. At 600 meters, a 338 impact produces a very specific type of disruption, not just the casualty, but the hydraulic shock effect that the remaining people in proximity witness. It stops movement. It creates a half-second of paralysis where everyone tries to understand what just happened. She used that half-second. Second shot. Different position in the column. She wasn't trying to destroy the element, she was trying to reshape it, force it to compress and reorganize, delay the advance. The rear of the column was already compressing toward the center as the front stopped. She worked the geometry. Third shot. The column broke into dispersal, fighters moving for the riverbank edges, using the low ground for cover, reorganizing. They'd identified the general direction of the fire by now. They were adapting. Good soldiers adapted fast. She respected that and accounted for it. She shifted position 2 meters left, breaking her outline against the rock, and waited. Below her in the valley, she could hear the firefight continuing, the steady crack of Ranger rifles on the southern position, occasionally the flat thump of a grenade launcher that Walsh must have gotten working. Her team was holding. Her team. She caught herself thinking it and didn't know what to do with it. She went back to the scope. The northeast column had reorganized faster than she'd hoped. They'd spread into a wider formation. Smart, it reduced the density of any single fire line, and were advancing again, using every piece of cover in the riverbed. A commander was pushing them. She could tell by the movement discipline. These weren't militia. They were trained fighters with a trained officer keeping them coherent under fire. She ranged the commander. He was staying back from the point, using a subordinate to pace the advance. Smart, he knew he was the priority target. He kept trees between himself and her general direction. He moved in short bounds, always stopping where he had concealment. But he had to look at his element to command it, and every time he looked at his element, he came out from behind something. She waited. 610 meters. Slightly closer now. She dialed. She breathed. She felt the rock warm under her elbows, the familiar pressure of the stock against her shoulder, the way the reticle steadied when her body found its natural position. The commander stepped out to check his front. She fired. The column stopped again. This time the reorganization was slower. Losing the command structure degraded the response time, exactly as the theory predicted and exactly as she'd seen play out more times than she wanted to remember. 7 rounds left. She needed to make them count. 12 minutes into her position on the shelf, something changed. She felt it before she understood it. A shift in the weight of the air, a sound that didn't belong. She pulled back from the scope and looked upward. Above her, on the cliff face, a figure was moving, not climbing toward her, moving laterally, along a higher ledge she hadn't clocked on her approach. 60, maybe 70 meters above her position and offset to the south. A single fighter, moving with the kind of careful, deliberate purpose that she recognized immediately. Not infantry, not assault. Another sniper. He hadn't found her yet. He was working from the sound of her shots, triangulating, and he was good enough that he'd gotten to a viable angle without her hearing him. In another 90 seconds, he'd have her. She shifted very slowly. Not fast, fast would catch his peripheral vision, rotating her position by about 40 degrees to face the cliff face rather than the valley. He was moving along the ledge with his rifle in one hand, using the other on the rock. She could see him clearly, lean, moving efficiently, wearing a coat that blended with the rock color almost perfectly. He hadn't stopped to look for her yet because he was still repositioning. She had maybe 60 seconds before he settled and started scanning. This was different from the valley shots. Those were geometry, range, wind, elevation, the clean math of distance. This was closer. 110 meters, roughly. She could see his face if she zoomed in. She didn't zoom in. She found the center of his mass and she held. He stopped. He started to unsling his rifle. She fired. The cliff face went quiet. She lay there for a moment, face pressed against the cool stone of the ledge, listening to her own heartbeat come back down. Then she went back to the scope and found the column below. They had reorganized. A new commander had taken over. She could tell by the movement signature. And they were coming again, faster this time, maybe 10 minutes out, 5 rounds left. She began working through her options and found, at the bottom of the calculation, that there weren't many. The QRF was still somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes out, depending on road conditions she couldn't see. Her position was discovered, or would be, once the surviving snipers team worked out where the return fire had come from. The northeast element had lost 2 commanders but retained cohesion and was advancing on a route that would bring them into the valley mouth in 10 minutes. She had 5 rounds. She thought about Captain Cross, about Hooper running the fire rotation below, about Walsh, who'd watched her with his mouth open and then done what she told him without asking why. About Garrett sitting up against the vehicle with a wound she hoped was actually as minor as it looked. She picked up the rifle, and she did what she'd always done, in the end, no matter what name she put on her credentials or what camera she hung around her neck. She went to work. The fifth and sixth shots broke the column's momentum for the third time and forced another dispersal. She fired the seventh into the new command element she'd identified. Not a kill shot, she was certain of that. She'd rushed the trigger pull 0.5 millimeter, but a hit, enough to take that man off the field. Eighth shot. The RPG team that had set up at the riverbed bend and was preparing to engage the valley. Ninth shot. Their backup loader. 2 rounds left. And then, from somewhere she hadn't anticipated, from the southern cliff position, from a fighter who'd worked his way along the rock to a direct angle on her shelf, a burst of automatic fire chewed across the limestone above her head, and she flattened hard against the ledge, stone chips raining down, the noise enormous and close. She was found. She rolled left, staying flat, moving away from her firing position, because the next burst would walk down from where the first had hit. It did. The rock where she'd been chewed up, sparks, dust, the smell of pulverized limestone. She came up at the new position, 2 meters left, got her eye behind the scope, found the shooter on the southern cliff. Fired. 1 round left. Below her in the valley, she heard something change. The pattern of gunfire shifted, less incoming. The Rangers were pressing now, which meant the fire from the southern position had degraded, which meant Walsh and Hooper had taken advantage of the disruption her shot had just caused. They were good. She'd been right about that from the beginning. The northeast column had gone to ground in the riverbed. Still there, still dangerous, but stopped. Without command cohesion and under fire, they'd lost their timetable. 1 round. She lay on the ledge and breathed, and then she heard something else. The sound carried on the wind, distant but distinct. Rotors. Military rotors, the heavy thud of Chinooks, multiple aircraft. The QRF. She looked at the 1 round left in her magazine. She thought about firing it and decided against it. Not because she didn't have a target, she had targets, but because the calculation had changed. The QRF changed the math entirely. The northeast element would know it too, in about 90 seconds when those aircraft appeared over the ridge. Trained fighters didn't hold position against air support. They withdrew. She held her position on the shelf and watched the rotors appear over the eastern ridge. 2 Chinooks with Apache escorts, coming in fast and low. The northeast column dissolved. She watched them go. Then she lay her cheek against the cool stock of the rifle and closed her eyes and let herself be still for a moment. Just a moment. In the way that she'd learned years ago was the only way to come back from the place your mind went when you worked like this. Come back. That was the whole thing, wasn't it? Come back. She came back. Below, in the valley, she could hear the QRF landing. Voices. Movement. The organized noise of people arriving to help, which was a different quality of noise than the organized noise of people in contact. Calmer, louder, more varied. She started climbing down. She was 20 meters from the base of the cliff when a voice came from below. Cross. Looking up at her, rifle slung, one hand shading his eyes against the dust. She came the rest of the way down and stood in front of him. Her hands were steady. She was aware of that. She was also aware of her heart rate, still elevated, and the way her shoulder ached from the stock pressure of 11 shots, and the way the cut on her left palm, she must have caught it on the rock, she hadn't noticed, was steadily dripping. Cross looked at her hand. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. Behind him, Walsh was standing with Garrett. Garrett was walking, which answered that question. Hooper was directing the QRF element. A medic was working on Kavanaugh. The valley, 60 seconds ago a kill zone, was becoming something else. A rescue site, a debrief location, a place where people tried to figure out what had just happened. Cross said, "Who are you?" She held the rifle against her thigh. The weight of it was familiar and terrible, and she was very tired of carrying it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then Walsh walked up beside Cross, and Walsh was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on a man's face directed at her. Not admiration, not confusion, not the recruitment poster grin. Something simpler than that. Something honest. 11 shots, Walsh said. He said it quietly, like a number he was still trying to make sense of. I was watching. I counted. He looked at Cross, then back at her. 11 shots. Cross didn't look away from her. "Who are you?" he said again. She opened her mouth, and from the northern ridge, from a position she'd cleared, from a position that should have been cold, a single shot cracked down into the valley. It hit the rock face 6 inches from Cross's left boot. Everyone moved at once. Cross went left. Walsh went right. Rangers across the valley floor found cover in the reflex of trained men who'd never fully stopped expecting contact. Mia didn't move. She stood exactly where she was, looking up at the north ridge, at the position she'd cleared, at the ledge where she'd counted 6 targets down. She'd counted 6, but she'd fired 5 shots at that position. The math was wrong. She'd known it was wrong, and in the chaos of the repositioning, she'd let it go and told herself it was fine. It wasn't fine. Someone was still up there. And from the body position, from the angle and the deliberate nature of the shot, which had hit 6 inches from Cross's boot instead of Cross, she understood immediately that this wasn't a missed shot. It was a message. She looked up at the ridge, at the position she couldn't see from here, and felt something move through her that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite recognition, but lived somewhere between the two. She knew that shot pattern. She'd trained with the man who fired it. The stone chip was still skittering across the road when Mia moved, not away from the ridge, toward it. She grabbed Cross by the plate carrier and pulled him sideways into the gap between the command vehicle and the cliff wall, a hard two-handed yank that he resisted for half a second before his training caught up with his surprise and he moved with her. The second shot came before they'd fully cleared the open ground. It hit the MRAP's rear quarter panel with a sound like a hammer on a bell, and they were behind the vehicle's bulk and down on one knee before the echo finished rolling through the valley. "Talk," Cross said. "Not a request. North Ridge, position 4. She was already scanning the cliff face above them, using the gap between the vehicle's undercarriage and the road surface, a sliver of elevated terrain visible if you pressed your cheek to the dirt. "I counted 6 targets at that position. I cleared 5. "You said you cleared that ridge." "I cleared what I could confirm. I couldn't confirm 6. She looked at him. "I made a call. It was the wrong call." He held her eyes for a moment. She waited for the anger and it didn't come. What came instead was something more useful, a recalibration, the expression of a man updating his situational picture without wasting time on blame. "How many rounds do you have?" "1. He reached across and handed her a magazine from his plate carrier. "AICS pattern. Will it fit?" She checked the spine. "Yes." She loaded it, chambered around. "Whoever's up there," she said, "they fired twice and didn't hit anyone. Maybe they're a bad shot." At that range, with that angle, a bad shot doesn't put 2 rounds within a meter of their intended target. They're not missing. She looked at the ridge again. They're communicating. Cross was quiet for a moment. Around them, the QRF had reorganized. She could hear Hooper directing the new element, getting people spread and covered, establishing a hasty perimeter. The Apaches were holding station above the eastern ridge, which meant the northeast column was staying gone for now. The valley had gone from active firefight to tense aftermath in under 4 minutes. "Communicating what?" Cross said. She didn't answer immediately, because the answer required explaining things she hadn't explained to anyone in 3 years, and she wasn't sure she had the right words for it yet, or the right version of those words, or whether this particular moment, crouched behind a disabled MRAP in a valley that smelled like propellant and dust, was the right place to start. "They know me," she said finally. Cross looked at her. She watched him decide not to push it. That surprised her. Most people pushed. "QRF commander is going to want that ridge cleared," he said. "I know." "Can you get back up there?" She looked at the cliff face. The route she'd taken was on the opposite side of the valley, now exposed, with a shooter at position 4 holding a sightline she couldn't identify precisely. Going back up the same way would take her through 200 meters of open ground at least partially visible to the north ridge. "Not the same route," she said. "There's a goat track on the south face, comes around the back of the northern ridge. Takes longer, but it approaches from above." She looked at him. "You knew about that track?" "I mapped this valley 3 days ago." "Why didn't you use it in your planning?" "It wasn't relevant to the mission profile." He paused. "It's relevant now." She thought about it for a few seconds. The goat track approach would take 20, maybe 25 minutes. The shooter at position 4 wasn't moving. The 2 deliberate shots meant he was holding, anchored to that position for a reason. waiting for something or someone. She needed to know which. "I'll need someone who knows the track," she said. "Walsh," Cross said without hesitation. She looked at him. "Walsh. He's got the energy and he keeps his mouth shut when it matters." She thought about the man who'd grabbed her arm in the valley, who'd made her explain herself with his eyes, even after she'd told him to get down, who'd then gone and done exactly what she'd said. "You sure about that last part?" "Relatively." Walsh didn't say anything when Cross gave him the tasking. He looked at Mia for a long moment, that recalibrating look again, the one she was getting used to seeing, and then he checked his rifle and said, "South face, yeah, I know the track." They moved out through the QRF perimeter while Hooper was still briefing the new element commander, a Lieutenant Sayers who had the faintly annoyed expression of someone who'd arrived late to a party that had already gotten complicated. Mia heard him asking Hooper what the contact situation was. "Largely resolved," Hooper said. "We've got one confirmed hostile still active on the North Ridge." "One?" "One." She didn't hear the rest. She and Walsh were moving along the cliff base, heading south, keeping the vehicle hulks and the QRF element between themselves and the North Ridge sightline. Walsh moved well. She noticed that immediately. He didn't crowd her, didn't try to set the pace, didn't narrate his own movement the way nervous soldiers sometimes did. He just moved, keeping a proper interval, scanning his sectors. After about 3 minutes, when they'd rounded the southern cliff base and were climbing toward the goat track, he said, "You want to tell me who's up there?" "Not particularly." "Okay." He climbed for a while. "Can you tell me if they're going to try to kill us?" She considered that. "Probably not me. You're a variable." "Great," Walsh said. "That's genuinely great." The goat track was exactly what it sounded like. A path worn into the cliff face by animals over what must have been generations. Narrow enough that they moved single file, their outer shoulders a foot from empty air and a 60-meter drop. Walsh went first because he knew the path. She followed, the SRS slung across her back, using both hands on the rock. Halfway up, Walsh stopped. "Listen," he said quietly. She listened. Wind. The distant thrum of the Apaches still holding station. And underneath both of those, something else. A sound she identified after a second as a radio. Low volume, static-laced, the kind of sound a field radio made when someone had it on receive and wasn't transmitting. 40 meters above them, give or take. "Position 4 is right above that sound," she said quietly. "Yeah." Walsh looked up the cliff face, then back at her. "So they're up there listening to something. Waiting for a signal." Signal for what? She didn't know. That was the honest answer, and she gave it to Walsh because he deserved it. "I don't know yet, but someone fired 2 deliberate non-lethal shots in a valley where everything else was aimed to kill. That's not military doctrine, that's personal." Walsh absorbed that. Then he said quietly, "Is this personal for you too?" She looked at him. He was watching her with those flat Texas eyes, not accusatory, not pushing for drama, just asking, the way someone asks a question they've already halfway answered. "Keep moving," she said. He turned and kept moving. They came over the top of the ridge 22 minutes after leaving the valley floor. The North Ridgeline was a different world from what she'd seen through the scope. Irregular terrain, limestone outcroppings, scrub vegetation clinging to the rock in the narrow shelves where soil had collected. She could see the positions she'd cleared, the disturbed rock, the brass casings she hadn't left, the dark stains on pale stone. The evidence of her morning's work laid out in a geography she could now walk through. Walsh was scanning left. She scanned right. Position 4 was another 40 meters along the ridge, around a natural bend in the cliff face. She could hear the radio more clearly now. Not words, just carrier signal, the soft static breath of an open channel. She put her hand on Walsh's arm and he stopped. She pointed to herself, then pointed ahead. Single file. She leads. He shook his head and pointed to himself. She shook her head back. They looked at each other for a moment, 2 adults having an argument in complete silence, and then Walsh made the expression of a man who has decided to let someone else be wrong first and stepped back. She moved around the bend. The man at position 4 was sitting with his back against a rock formation, rifle across his knees, radio on the stone beside him. He was looking at her. He'd been looking at her direction before she came around the bend. He'd known she was coming. He was older than she remembered. The beard was new. There were lines in his face that hadn't been there before. The kind of lines that came from time spent outside and time spent not sleeping, and possibly from time spent thinking about things that didn't have good endings. I was wearing civilian clothes under a military pattern vest, which was not a combination that put him cleanly in any category she had a name for. He looked at her rifle. "You going to use that?" he said. His voice was the same. That was the strange part. Everything else was different. The face, the posture, the quality of stillness around him, which was different from the stillness she remembered, less controlled and more resigned. But the voice was exactly the same. "I haven't decided," she said. Walsh came around the bend. He saw the man. He brought his rifle up. "Walsh," she said, "I see him." "Hold." Walsh didn't lower his rifle, but he didn't fire. His eyes went between her and the man on the rock, doing the math, not understanding the equation. The man looked at Walsh with the mild curiosity of someone who found him only marginally relevant. Then he looked back at Mia. "You took 9 of my people," he said. "You had more than 9 people in that valley. The others weren't mine. They were the clients." He tilted his head slightly. "The ones you can count were mine." "I counted 8. 9. You missed 1. She had missed 1. She'd known it, probably, on some level, the moment the second shot came in from position 4. The instinct that said the geometry was wrong, that the first shooter she'd hit at that position hadn't been the only one. "The spotter," she said. "He made it to the eastern ridge before the QRF arrived." A pause. "He won't say anything useful. I made sure of that before I sent him." Walsh said, "Who is this guy?" Neither of them answered him. The man on the rock reached slowly to his side. Walsh's rifle tracked him and picked up the radio. He set it down again without keying it. The gesture meant nothing she could identify, and she didn't like that. She'd been able to read this man once. She wasn't sure she could anymore. "Why the 2 shots?" she said. "To get you up here. You could have sent a message." "You don't have a phone number anymore, and I didn't want to use channels that could be monitored." He looked at her steadily. "I needed to talk to you without the captain and his QRF in the room." "So you orchestrated an ambush." "I facilitated an ambush that was already planned. The Valley operation was the client's. I was attached as a technical asset." Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. "I didn't know it was your convoy until the night before. By then it was too late to stop it cleanly." "Too late," she repeated. "I delayed the northeast element by 40 minutes. That's why your QRF window was survivable." He held her eyes. "You're welcome." Walsh made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He wants a thank you? Walsh." She kept her eyes on the man. "Be quiet." "Mia," Walsh said. And the fact that he used her name, not Torres, not journalist, not ma'am, told her he was more alarmed than he was showing. The man on the rock was watching all of this. He'd always been good at reading rooms. That hadn't changed. "What do you want?" she said. "To warn you." He paused. "The client isn't done. The Valley was the opening move. The real objective is Black Ridge FUB." She went still. "Timeline?" she said. 48 hours? Maybe less, depending on what they assess from today. He glanced at Walsh, then back. "The client has someone inside the base. I don't know who. I wasn't read in on that piece. But the inside asset is how they know about the convoy route, the timing, the vehicle configuration." She processed that. Around her, the wind moved across the ridge with the steady indifference of high-altitude air, and somewhere below, the Apaches made their slow circuit of the valley. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. It was the real question, not the tactical information. She could handle tactical information. The real question was the one underneath it, the one that asked why a man who'd been on the opposing side of an ambush this morning was now sitting on a ridge passing intelligence to the team that had just killed 8 of his people. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't know it was you," he said again, and this time the sentence carried more weight than it had the first time. "And because you should know that the person running the client-side operation is someone you know too." The wind moved. "Who?" she said. He told her. She didn't move. She didn't change her expression. She stood exactly where she was on the north ridge of Ashen Valley, with the rifle in her hands and the morning sun finally reaching the rock beneath her boots. and she took the name he'd given her and she put it somewhere she could hold it without reacting to it. Walsh was watching her face. She could feel it. Okay, she said. That's it? Okay? What do you want me to say? The man on the rock stood up. He did it slowly, hands visible, rifle still across his knees. He was taller than she remembered, or she'd misremembered. He reached into his vest and produced a folded piece of paper and held it out. Coordinates, he said. The staging area for the second phase. It's outside air coverage range, so your QRF won't see it on standard Overwatch. He paused. And a frequency. You can reach me on it for 72 hours. After that, the window closes. She took the paper. She didn't unfold it. You're going to walk away from this, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. I should detain you. Yes. He picked up his rifle, not pointing it, just picking it up, slinging it. The gesture of a man preparing to leave. But you won't. Walsh stepped forward. The hell she won't. You just told us you were… Walsh, her voice was flat and final. Stand down. Walsh stopped. He was breathing hard, not from exertion. He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't speak. The man looked at her one more time. And for just a second she wouldn't be able to describe accurately later because it was too brief and too complicated. Something crossed his face that she recognized. Not regret exactly. Something older than regret. Something that didn't have a clean name. Stay alive, Mia, he said. He turned and walked north along the ridge. She watched him go. Walsh stood beside her, his rifle half raised and his face doing several things at once. He waited until the figure had disappeared behind the next outcropping, and then he waited another full minute, and then he said, You want to explain what just happened? Not right now. He was part of the ambush. Yes. And you let him walk? Yes. Cross is going to want… I know what Cross is going to want. She folded the coordinates paper and put it inside her vest. Let me think. Walsh was quiet. She gave him credit for that. He didn't push, didn't argue, didn't do the thing that most people did when they were scared and confused, which was fill the silence with noise. She looked out across the valley. From up here she could see the full shape of it. The road, the vehicles, the QRF element spread across the floor, the tiny figures of men doing the work of aftermath. She could see the shelf where she'd lain for those 40-something minutes. She could see the position she'd cleared, the scree trails, the disturbed rock. She could see the whole geometry of the morning laid out below her, the way you could only ever see the full shape of something after you'd survived it. The man who'd just walked north along the ridge was named Reyes. Victor Reyes. She'd known him for 6 years. She'd trusted him with things she didn't trust people with. Her positioning, her wind calls, her back during Overwatch rotations in 3 different countries. He'd been her spotter for 2 years and then her team leader for 1, and then there had been a night in a valley not entirely unlike this one, where something had gone wrong in a way that it had never been properly explained, and a teammate had died and Mia had put down her rifle and walked away and not looked back. She hadn't seen Reyes since. She'd thought about him. She'd thought about him more than she was comfortable admitting, in the way you thought about someone who was attached to your worst memory. Not with fondness and not with hatred, but with the complicated, exhausting weight of shared history that couldn't be revised. He was working for someone. She didn't know the full shape of it yet. The name he'd given her for the operation commander was real. She knew it was real because it fit a pattern of things she'd been trying not to think about for 3 years. And real information fit into the space that was waiting for it, and false information didn't. The name was Carver, Marcus Carver. A man she knew considerably less well than she knew Reyes, but who she'd been aware of the way you were aware of things on the periphery of your life that you hoped would stay peripheral. He hadn't stayed peripheral. Torres, Walsh said. She turned. We need to get back down. Yeah. Cross is going to ask what happened up here. I know. What do you want me to say? She looked at him. He was watching her with that flat, earnest gaze, not trying to manipulate her, not angling for something, just asking, because he was the kind of man who wanted to know which direction they were all pointing before he started walking. Tell him we found the position. No hostile present. She paused. That's accurate. Walsh thought about it. That's accurate, he agreed slowly. Then, but it's not complete. No. You're going to tell him the rest. Yes. She started toward the goat track. When I know how much of the rest I understand. Walsh followed her. They moved single file back down the track, the valley opening below them as they descended, the morning light now fully in the basin and burning the dust gold. Halfway down, Walsh said, "The guy. You knew him?" "Yes. For a long time?" "Long enough." "And the name he gave you, the person running the other side?" Walsh was watching his feet on the track, but his voice was careful. "That's someone you know too." She didn't answer. "Okay," Walsh said. "Okay." They reached the valley floor. Across the basin, Hooper had seen them coming down and was moving toward them, and behind Hooper she could see Cross standing by the command vehicle, talking to the QRF lieutenant, one eye tracking her descent. She walked through the dust and the aftermath smell and the strange, specific quiet that settled over a battlefield after the fighting stopped. Not peaceful, not silent, but a different quality of noise, the noise of things being put back into some shape that could be carried forward. Cross met her at the vehicle. He looked at Walsh. Walsh looked at the ground, then at the sky, then at something in the middle distance. Cross looked back at Mia. "Hostile neutralized?" he said. "Position is clear." He waited. She let him wait. She was organizing things in her head, the coordinates, the frequency, the timeline Reyes had given her, the name Carver, and what it attached to, and how much of that attachment she was ready to explain, and to whom. 48 hours. Maybe less. "Captain," she said, "I need to brief you privately. Not the QRF lieutenant. Not Hooper yet. You first." Cross looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Walsh, who had found something very interesting to study on the horizon. "Walsh," Cross said. "Sir?" "Go help Hooper with the vehicle accountability." "Yes, sir." Walsh walked away without looking back, and she noticed that he didn't go directly to Hooper. He went to Garrett first, and she saw him put a hand on Garrett's shoulder briefly, checking in, the thing that men who knew each other did after the shooting stopped. Cross waited until Walsh was out of earshot. "How bad?" he said. "The valley wasn't the operation, it was the opening." His jaw tightened slightly. "Not much. He was good at this." "Black Ridge?" he said. She looked at him. "You're not surprised?" "I've been wondering about the route compromise for 2 weeks. Someone gave them our timing. I didn't have a source." He paused. "You do now." "Someone inside your base, according to my source. I don't have an identity." "Your source?" He said it neutrally, without inflection, which she recognized as a man choosing not to ask the question he most wanted to ask. 48 hours, she said. "That's the timeline for the second phase." Cross was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cliff face. He looked at the valley road, at the disabled vehicles, at his team spread across the basin, Kavanaugh on the litter, Garrett upright, Walsh with Hooper now, running vehicle checks with the systematic focus of men who needed to do something physical with their hands after a morning like this. "You're going to tell me who your source is," he said. "Eventually." "Eventually," she agreed. "And you're going to tell me everything else you know." "Yes." "But not yet." "Not yet." She held his eyes. "I need to verify something first, and I need to do it without putting your people at more risk than they're already carrying." Cross looked at her for a long time. She could see him wanting to push. The captain instinct, the chain of command instinct, the reasonable human instinct of a man who'd just survived an ambush and wanted all the information on the table right now. She could see him weigh it. He didn't push. "You have until we reach Black Ridge," he said. "The moment we're back inside the wire, I want everything." "Understood." He nodded once, then turned toward the QRF lieutenant. She stood in the dust and watched him walk away and felt the coordinates paper against her ribs, and thought about Reyes walking north along the ridge, and Carver's name sitting in her head like something that had been waiting there for a long time, patient as the mountains, waiting for her to come back to it. 48 hours. She turned and looked at the road that led back to Black Ridge and thought, it won't be 48 hours. Reyes had given her the conservative estimate. Someone running an operation of this size didn't wait 2 days if the opening move had been disrupted. The disruption would accelerate the timeline. They would compress, reorganize, and move faster to recover the initiative. She'd disrupted the opening move, which meant she'd probably cut the timeline in half. 24 hours. Maybe less. She looked at the sun. Midday, roughly. The valley shadows were shrinking as the sun climbed. She needed to move. She picked up her pack from beside the command vehicle, checked the rifle, and went to find Cross to tell him they needed to leave the valley immediately. Right now. Not when the QRF lieutenant finished his accountability brief. Now. Hooper intercepted her first. He was coming from the direction of the third vehicle with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Hooper was a controlled man. She'd noticed that in the DFAC, in the briefing, in the valley. He wore his feelings inside, where they were useful, not outside, where they got in the way. He wasn't wearing this one inside. The third vehicle, he said. What about it? Radio, the encrypted set. He looked at her. His voice was completely flat. Someone's been into it. The cryptophil is gone. The ComSec module. She stared at him. Replaced with a dummy module, he said. We've been broadcasting in the clear since we left the fob. A pause. Every transmission we made this morning. She looked at the vehicle. She looked at the valley around them. She looked at the road that led back to Black Ridge. The inside asset. Not waiting at the phobie. She turned slowly and looked at the faces around her. Hooper, Walsh, Garrett, the QRF element, Lieutenant Sayers running his briefing 20 meters away. The mechanics, the medics, the drivers. 11 Rangers. One of them had gotten into that radio. She didn't say it out loud. That was the first discipline. You didn't say we have a mole in a valley full of people when you didn't know which person was the mole. You kept your face neutral and your voice level, and you moved the information from the place where it would cause panic to the place where it could be used. Hooper was watching her. Who knows about the cryptophil? She said quietly. Me. Now you. He paused. I found it during vehicle accountability. I haven't reported it up yet. Don't. Not yet. She held his eyes. Where's the dummy module now? In my kit. Keep it there. Don't tell anyone you found it. Not Walsh, not Garrett, not your QRF counterpart. She glanced at Lieutenant Sayers across the basin, still running his brief. Especially not anyone you can't personally vouch for. Hooper's expression didn't change much, but something behind it did. He was a careful man, and careful men understood implications quickly. You think it's one of ours. The module didn't replace itself. A long pause. The wind moved dust across the road between them. I've been with these men for 2 years, he said. His voice was completely controlled. That control cost him something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. I know, she said. Do it anyway. He nodded once and walked back toward the vehicles. She turned and found Cross. She told him in 2 minutes, standing beside the cliff wall with their backs to the basin and their voices below the ambient noise of the QRF element working around them. She told him about the crypto module, about Hooper's find, about the implication of broadcast clear transmission since departure. Cross listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 4 seconds. Everything we said on that radio this morning, he said. Position reports, vehicle status, casualty count, request for QRF. Yes. They knew where we were every step, and what we had left. He looked at the vehicles. He looked at his team. He looked at Sayers across the basin with the expression of a man who had just added a layer of complexity to a problem that was already complicated enough. Sayers needs to know, he said. Sayers might be the asset. Cross looked at her sharply. I'm not saying he is, she said. I'm saying we don't know. And until we know, every person who wasn't in your original 12 is a variable. Sayers is regular Army. He's not even Ranger qualified. Neither am I. He held her gaze. She watched him absorb that. The reminder that she had walked into his convoy with a press credential and 11 rounds and a pass she hadn't disclosed, and that the lesson of the morning was that people were not always what their paperwork said. What do you need? He said. Get us back to Black Ridge. Move faster than the standard return timeline. Don't use the radio for anything except absolute emergency, and if you have to use it, assume the traffic is being monitored. She paused. And I need access to your personnel files when we reach the FOB. Personnel files are classified. I know. You're a journalist. I know that too. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Mount up. We're moving in 10 minutes. And he walked toward Sayers without waiting for her response. The return convoy ran faster than standard. Cross had told Sayers they needed to clear the valley before the eastern ridge lost its Apache coverage window, which was accurate enough. They ran 3 vehicles instead of 4, leaving the disabled MRAP with 2 QRF Rangers as security pending a recovery team. Kavanaugh rode in the back of the 3rd vehicle, stable, the head wound cleaned and dressed by Okafor. Garrett rode beside him, left arm in a field sling, complaining about it in the low-key, persistent way of men who were not seriously injured but wanted acknowledgement. Mia rode in the command vehicle again. This time she sat directly behind Cross, close enough to the radio that she could hear everything on the net, and she listened to every transmission with the specific attention of someone trying to hear what wasn't being said. Walsh sat across from her. He didn't talk. He watched the valley walls give way to open terrain and then the FOB approach road, and occasionally he glanced at her with the expression of a man who had decided to wait rather than ask and was finding the waiting difficult. 40 minutes after leaving the valley, the convoy rolled through Black Ridge's main gate. The base looked exactly as she'd cataloged it on arrival. The sandbag walls, the comm arrays, the motor pool, the DFX, all of it the same. But the same the way a room looked the same after someone had been through it, technically unchanged and somehow wrong. She got out of the vehicle and stood in the motor pool and looked at the base with new eyes. 48 hours. Probably less. Cross was debriefing Sayers near the command vehicle. She gave them 2 minutes and then she walked across and said, "I need that file access." Sayers looked at her. "Who is she?" "Embedded Press," Cross said. "Embedded Press doesn't get personnel file access." "She does today." Cross looked at Sayers with the flat authority of a man who didn't want to explain himself and wasn't going to. "I'll take responsibility." Sayers looked between them. He had the look of a man who knew he was being managed and didn't have enough information to push back effectively. "This goes in my report," he said. "Everything goes in your report," Cross said. "That's what reports are for." Sayers walked away. Bong. The personnel files were in the S1 office. Administrative, 3 filing cabinets, and a computer terminal that ran slower than it should have for something this critical. Cross got her into the system and then stood at the door while she worked. She wasn't looking for obvious things. Obvious things didn't survive to become inside assets. People with visible loyalty problems got filtered out early. She was looking for patterns, financial irregularities, communication records. Assignment history overlaps with known operational areas of organization she had reasons to know about. She worked through the files methodically. 12 Rangers on the team, plus the support staff, comms, motor pool, medical, supply. 31 personnel total with access to the FOB's radio infrastructure and convoy planning documents. 31 people. She found it in 40 minutes. Not a smoking gun. It was never a smoking gun. It was a pattern. A small, careful, well-constructed pattern that would have been invisible to someone who didn't know what they were looking for and hadn't spent 3 years trying not to think about the thing that made this pattern recognizable. She sat back in the chair. "Cross," she said. He came in from the doorway. She turned the screen toward him. "Staff Sergeant Riley, motor pool supervisor." Cross looked at the file. "Riley's been here 14 months. His previous assignment was FOB Salerno. Before that, a logistics post in Kandahar that was decommissioned 18 months ago." She pointed at the screen. The decommissioning audit flagged a material discrepancy. Equipment reported destroyed, later found in circulation with a non-state actor group operating in the eastern provinces. The audit was inconclusive. Riley wasn't specifically named. He wasn't cleared either. He was transferred. There's a difference. She looked at Cross. And his financial disclosure from 8 months ago shows a home purchase, cash transaction. His base salary doesn't carry that. Cross was quiet. "It's circumstantial," she said. "I know, but the crypto module was accessed in the motor pool vehicle bay. The vehicles were staged there from 0400 to 0530 before we moved out. Riley runs that bay. I need more than circumstantial." "I know." She stood. "I need to talk to Reyes." Cross looked at her. She'd given him Reyes's name on the drive back, the minimum necessary, enough to explain the source without explaining the full history. He'd taken it the way he took most things, quietly, processing. "The man from the ridge," he said. "Yes." "The man you let walk?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Is he going to answer? She thought about Reyes sitting on that rock with his rifle across his knees, telling her to stay alive. She thought about the frequency on the paper against her ribs, and the 72-hour window, and the fact that Reyes had never in 6 years given her information that was wrong. Yes, she said. On. She used the comms room at 2200, when the base had settled into its night rhythm, and the duty officer was a young corporal who Cross had spoken to briefly and who had found somewhere else to be for 30 minutes. The frequency was military band, narrow, the kind of transmission that would look like noise to anyone not specifically tuned to it. She keyed the handset and gave the challenge sequence Reyes had included on the folded paper. 3 numbers, a pause, 2 more. 14 seconds of static. Then, "You move fast." 48 hours was optimistic, she said. "I know, I gave you the conservative number." A pause, the slight compression of a field radio on low power. "You found the inside man." "I found a candidate. I need confirmation." "Riley." She closed her eyes for a second. "Yes." "He's been in place for 8 months. Carver's people recruited him at Salerno. He had a gambling problem that got solved very quickly after a conversation with the right people." Another pause. "He's not combat. He moves information and he accesses equipment. He's not going to fight anyone." "Can he be turned?" Silence for a moment. "Turned to what purpose?" "If Carver's people know the FOB layout through Riley's reporting, then Riley controls what Carver's people know. If we control Riley, you feed Carver bad information." A pause. "That's not a bad idea." "I need to know if Riley has a dead man's switch, a check-in protocol that alerts his handler if he goes silent or changes pattern." "Yes." "Daily transmission, 0100 local, 30 seconds, confirmation code." She looked at the clock on the wall. 22:17. She had 2 hours and 43 minutes. "I need the confirmation code." Reyes was quiet for longer than she liked. "Reyes." "I'm thinking about what I'm doing," he said. His voice was level. "Give me a second." She gave him the second. "The code is dynamic," he said. "It changes daily. It's based on the date and a base number that I know." A pause. "I can give you today's code. I can give you tomorrow's." "And after that?" "After that, I won't be in a position to give you anything." She understood what that meant. She didn't ask him to elaborate. "Give me the codes." He gave her 2 strings of numbers. She wrote them on the back of the coordinate paper. "Mia," he said. "What?" "Carver knows you were in the valley. The element that came back reported a female shooter on the overwatch position." A pause. "He's going to know it was you. He's the one who's been watching your byline for the past 2 years." She hadn't known that. She kept her voice level. "Why?" "Because of what you know. About the night at Coast. About what actually happened to your teammate." His voice was careful, measured. "Carver was the operations officer for that mission, Mia. He's known since that night that you were the one person who could put together what he did. And he's been waiting for you to either disappear completely or step back into a context where he could manage you." The room was very quiet. "He set up the Coast mission," she said. It wasn't a question. "He set up the kill. Your teammate wasn't a casualty. He was a target." A pause that felt longer than it was. "I didn't know until 6 months ago. That's why I'm on this ridge instead of wherever Carver thinks I am." She sat with that for a moment. 3 years. 3 years of carrying a death. She thought was her fault. Her hesitation, her positioning error, her read on the terrain that had been wrong. 3 years of believing that her mistake had killed the man beside her. Reyes let her sit with it. He'd always been good at silence. "Okay," she said. "That's the second time you've said okay to something that should be breaking you." "It is breaking me," she said. "I'm just not doing it on the radio." A pause. Then quietly. "Fair enough." "Carver's timeline. You said maybe less than 48 hours. Based on what came back from the valley, I think he moves tomorrow night. He's going to assess the disruption, determine that waiting increases his exposure, and compress." A pause. "He'll hit the FOB directly. Not another convoy. The FOB itself. He'll use Riley to open the south perimeter, the timber patch section. That's been part of the plan since Riley mapped the base." She thought about the south perimeter gap she'd noticed on her first afternoon. The timber patch that didn't fit properly. She'd filed it away as a maintenance issue. It was an entry point. "How many fighters?" she said. He'll bring what survived the valley, minus the northeast element that withdrew. They're gone. They won't regroup in time. He has maybe 20 fighters still operable, plus whatever the client provides for direct support. 20 against a reinforced FOB. 20 who know the layout, know the defender strength, know which building is the comms center and which is the armory, know the duty officer rotation. A pause. With the south perimeter opened from the inside. They'll go for the comms first. Comms, then command, in that order. Isolate and blind before they push the assault element. She thought about the base at night, the duty rotations, the guard positions she'd cataloged on day one without knowing she was doing it. Reyes, she said. Yeah. Are you going to be there tomorrow night? The longest pause yet. I don't know, he said. And for the first time since position 4 on the North Ridge, she heard something in his voice that wasn't controlled. I don't know what I'm doing after this conversation. I've been working toward this conversation for 6 months, and I haven't planned past it. That's honest. I'm trying. A brief static burst on the line. The window closes in 72 hours either way. After that, I don't know. I'll figure it out. Reyes. Yeah. Thank you. Another pause. Stay alive, he said, and the line went to static. She found Cross in his quarters at 2300. He opened the door before she knocked twice, which told her he hadn't been sleeping. She told him everything. The Coast mission, Carver, Riley's role, the South Perimeter plan, the timeline. She told it in the flat, sequential way she'd learned to brief. No editorializing, no emphasis on the personal parts, just the operational information in the order it was needed. Cross listened. He sat on the edge of his bunk with his hands on his knees, and he listened to all of it without stopping her. When she finished, he said, Your teammate, the one who died at cost. Yes. You've been carrying that for 3 years. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She waited for him to say something about it. Something compassionate or something useless, either one. But he didn't. He filed it and moved forward, which was what she needed him to do. Riley, he said, we need him functional and cooperative before 0100. That's 90 minutes. I know. He stood. I'll handle Riley. I need you to walk the south perimeter with Hooper and tell me what a forced entry looks like from the outside. Okay. And Torres. He stopped. She waited. The thing about cost, that changes the shape of tomorrow night for you. You understand that? Yes. Carver will be there. I know. Are you going to be able to see Cross? She held his eyes. I've been able to do things today that I told myself I was done doing. I think the question of what I'm able to do is settled for tonight. He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. Riley was in the motor pool at 2320 doing a maintenance check on the recovery vehicle that wasn't due for service until Thursday. Mia had suggested Cross approach him there rather than pulling him from his bunk. A man pulled from sleep was defensive before the conversation started, but a man caught in the middle of activity that looked routine was still in his normal operational headspace, still manageable. She watched from the doorway of the parts bay while Cross went in. She couldn't hear the conversation. She watched the body language. Riley was a compact man, mid-30s, with the kind of tan that came from years at altitude rather than any particular geography. He'd been under the recovery vehicle's chassis when Cross walked in. He'd come out slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, and she'd seen the precise moment he realized what was happening. A half-second of stillness, then the forced resumption of normalcy, then the stillness again when Cross said something she couldn't hear. Riley's hand stopped moving on the rag. Cross said something else. Riley looked at the floor, then at Cross, then at the floor. He sat down on the wheel well of the recovery vehicle and put his face in his hands. It took 11 minutes. She tracked it on her watch. 11 minutes from Cross walking into the motor pool to Riley's posture going from defensive to collapsed. Not broken. She'd seen broken. This wasn't that. But the specific deflation of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had just been told they could put it down, at a price. Cross came back to the parts bay doorway. He'll cooperate, he said. The 0100 transmission? He'll make it. I'll be there when he does. He paused. He's scared. He didn't understand the full scope of what Carver was building. He thought he was passing convoy routes. When I told him what the second phase looks like, Cross stopped. He has a daughter. 8 years old, in Georgia. She didn't say anything. Carver's people know about her, Cross said. That's the other piece of the leverage. Beyond the money. She thought about that. She thought about a man making a bad decision in the dark, and then finding out the dark was larger than he'd understood, with walls he couldn't see. He needs a lawyer, she said. He needs several things. That's above my pay grade, and I'll make sure the right people know it. He looked at her. Tonight, he's useful. Yes. At 0100, Riley made his transmission. Cross stood beside him in the comms room, and Mia stood in the doorway, and Riley's voice was perfectly steady, which told her something about the man that she filed away without judgment. The confirmation code Reyes had given her was correct. The transmission lasted 28 seconds. Carver's people would believe Riley was in place. They'd believe the base was still unaware. They'd believe the south perimeter timber gap was still unguarded. They'd believe all of that because Riley had told them, and Riley had told them because Cross had given him the script. And the script was designed by the woman with a freelance press credential who had arrived 2 days ago carrying a camera. After the transmission, Riley sat very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, "Is my daughter going to be okay?" Cross said, "I'm making calls in the morning. She'll have protection before noon." Riley nodded. He kept nodding for a few seconds after it was necessary, the way people did when they'd run out of other things to do with their bodies. Mia went back out into the night. She spent the next 4 hours on the south perimeter with Hooper. They walked it twice, once at normal pace, once at the crawl she used when she was actually assessing terrain rather than traversing it. The timber patch was exactly what she'd clocked on day one. A 3-meter section of the sandbag wall where the original construction had been damaged and repaired with timber framing that sat slightly lower than the surrounding wall and would be easy to breach quietly with the right tools. Beyond it, open ground for about 40 meters, then the cliff approach from the south. "They'll come from the cliff approach," she told Hooper. "Use the natural cover to get to the perimeter, then breach the timber section. Quiet breach, because they want comms hit before anyone reacts." "How many people on the breach element?" "Small, 4, maybe 5. The main force holds outside until the perimeter is open." She looked at the timber patch. "They'll have a trigger. Breach element signals clear. Main force comes through." Hooper looked at the wall. He looked at the space beyond it. "If we're waiting on the other side of this—" "Not waiting," she said. "We let the breach element through. We want them inside, committed, before we close the door." She paused. "Carver needs to believe the breach succeeded until his main force is in the kill zone." Hooper was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be tense." "Yes." "How confident are you in the timeline, tomorrow night?" "Reasonably confident. My source has been accurate on everything else." "Your source?" He said it the same way Cross had, neutrally, without inflection. "I know," she said. "I know what it sounds like. It sounds like someone who was on the other side of this morning is now feeding us the playbook for tomorrow night." He looked at her. "That's either the most valuable thing that's happened today, or it's the setup for something worse." "I've thought about that." "And?" She looked at the timber patch, at the dark space beyond the wall, at the cliff approach she couldn't see in the dark but knew was there. "And I've known this man for 6 years," she said. "I know what he sounds like when he's lying, and I know what he sounds like when he's not." She paused. "He's not lying. You'd stake your life on that." "I already have," she said. "Twice today." Hooper absorbed that. Then he said, "Okay, walk me through the positioning." She walked him through it. She laid out the whole approach, where the Rangers would hold, how the response element would be staged, how the comms building would be hardened before any of it started. She drew it out in the dirt with a stick, the base layout from memory, and Hooper crouched beside her and asked the right questions, and she answered them. It took 2 hours. She was aware, in the back of her mind, that she was planning a defensive operation for a military base in a country she wasn't assigned to, for a unit she wasn't part of, based on intelligence from a source she had never formally reported. She was aware that everything about this was irregular, and that the people who dealt with irregular things were going to have a great deal to say about it afterward. Afterward was afterward. She'd worry about it then. By 0400, they had a plan. By 0500, Cross had briefed it to Hooper and Walsh and the 4 Rangers he'd selected for the breach response element. He'd kept the briefing tight, 6 people plus Mia, in his quarters, door closed, no QRF personnel. Not yet. Walsh had listened to the whole brief without saying a word. When Cross finished, Walsh looked at the dirt map Mia had redrawn on a piece of paper and said, "The breach element comes through and we let them go past us." "Yes," Cross said, "and then we close the exit." "Yes." Walsh looked at Mia. "And you're where? In this?" "South perimeter, breach point. I'm the one who closes the exit." Walsh stared at her. "Alone." "You need your people on the main force kill zone. That's where the numbers are." She met his eyes. "The breach element is 4 or 5 fighters. I can manage 4 or 5. You were managing 11 this morning, and that was with the high ground and a scoped rifle. This is different." "Yeah, it's worse." "Walsh," Cross said. "Sir, I'm just—" "I heard you. Noted." Cross looked at Mia. "You need support at the breach point. Take Walsh." "I don't—" "That's not a suggestion." He held her eyes. She looked at Walsh. Walsh looked at her with his jaw set and his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had decided something and wasn't going to undecide it. "Fine," she said. Walsh uncrossed his arms. "Fine," he agreed, and she could hear in his voice that he'd been prepared to argue considerably longer, if necessary. The day passed the way days passed before operations, in the specific slow motion of people who were waiting and trying not to show it. The base ran its normal rhythm. Guard rotations, meal times, maintenance schedules. Riley worked the motor pool and Cross kept a man near him without making it obvious. Mia slept for 3 hours in the afternoon. Not because she was relaxed, but because she'd learned long ago that you slept when you could, because you couldn't predict when the next window would be. She woke at 1700 with the flat, clear-headed feeling of someone whose body had done its accounting and come up short but functional. She ate. She checked the rifle Cavanaugh had authorized her to keep. He'd been coherent enough by afternoon to make that decision himself, and had made it in the specific way of a man who'd watched someone work his weapon better than he could have in his current condition. She field-stripped the SRS, cleaned it, reassembled it, function-checked it. Walsh watched her from across the table. "You do that every time?" he said. "Before every operation." "What if you don't have time?" "Then you do it as fast as you can." She looked up. "Are you going to be all right tonight?" He blinked. "Am I going to—" He stopped. "You're asking me." "Yes." He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't give her the automatic answer. "I've been in 3 firefights," he said. "This morning was the 3rd. I'm not rattled, if that's what you're asking. I'm oriented." He paused. "Is that a word for it?" "That's a word for it." "Are you all right?" She thought about Cost, about the name Carver, about Riez on the ridge with 3 years of time between them and a 6-month plan that had led to a ridge in Ashen Valley and a folded piece of paper. "Ask me tomorrow," she said. Walsh nodded like that was a reasonable answer. Maybe it was. At 2100, she took her position at the south perimeter. At 2230, she heard the first movement on the cliff approach. She pressed herself into the shadow of the sandbag wall and looked at Walsh, 3 meters to her right, also flat against the wall, rifle up, breathing steady. He was looking at her. She held up 4 fingers. He nodded. 4 figures on the approach. Moving well, trained, professional, using the terrain cover the way someone had taught them to. They reached the timber patch and she heard the quiet, specific sounds of a breach tool working the frame. Not destructive, careful, the sound of people who needed to open a door without slamming it. The timber section came free. The first figure came through. She let him pass. He moved toward the comms building, exactly as projected. The second figure came through, the third. The fourth stopped at the breach point. He was the trigger, the one who signaled clear to the main force waiting at the cliff base. She could see the radio in his hand. He was about to key it. She moved. She came off the wall in the space between his trigger finger and the transmit button, one hand on the radio and one on his rifle before he'd processed that something was wrong with the dark around him. She took the rifle with a twist that used his own grip against him, used her forearm across his throat to take him down backward against the sandbag wall. Controlled, quiet, no shots fired. He hit the wall and went down, and she had her knee on his chest and the radio in her left hand before he made a sound. Walsh was already moving on the third figure, who had turned at the sound. She heard a brief scuffle behind her, sharp, quick, ending in the sound of someone hitting the ground. She keyed the radio, gave the clear signal. From outside the perimeter, at the cliff base, the main force began to move. She looked at Walsh. He had the third figure controlled, face down, hands behind his back. He looked at her. She looked at the open breach point and the 20 fighters about to come through it. She keyed her own radio, the internal comms, crosses net. Breach is open, she said. Main force is moving, 30 seconds. Cross came back immediately. All elements, stand by, let them in. Walsh pulled the third fighter against the wall, out of the breach point's line of sight, and held him there with his forearm, and the specific weight of a man who had decided not to move regardless of what happened next. The first fighters of the main force came through the timber gap, one by one, into the dark, into the base they thought was unaware. She counted them through. At 15, the breach point was fully committed. At 17, she heard Cross's voice on the net, very calm, very final. All elements, execute. The base lights came on all at once, every one of them. The whole interior of Black Ridge lit up like noon, floodlights triggering simultaneously from 6 positions, and in the sudden white blaze of it she saw the main force element frozen in the open ground between the perimeter wall and the first buildings, caught in the transition between stealth and assault, in the worst possible place, in full light, with rangers coming from 4 directions at once. It lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds pure operational shock, while 17 fighters tried to understand what had happened to the darkness they'd been counting on. She was moving before the 4 seconds finished. She wasn't going to the main force engagement. Cross had that. Hooper had that. The 4 rangers of the response element had that. She was moving deeper into the base, toward the command building, because Carver wouldn't come through the timber gap with the assault element. Carver would come in from the east. She'd worked it out at 0300, lying on her bunk in the 3 hours before her alarm. A man who ran operations didn't lead the breach. He came in from the secondary approach, the one the defenders focused on last, after they'd committed to the primary engagement. Carver had been doing this long enough to know that the east gate, with the guards committed to the south perimeter response, would be the softest point in the base at the moment of maximum confusion. She was running now. Across the lit compound, through the noise of the engagement behind her, toward the east gate. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of the east gate latch giving way, not forced, opened from the inside by someone with a key or a copied code, and then the gate swinging back and 3 figures coming through, moving fast in the way of people who expected confusion to cover them. She stopped at the corner of the armory building. The 3 figures came across the compound. 2 she didn't know. The third she recognized by his walk, the specific, controlled, slightly forward-leaning gait of a man who was always moving toward something rather than away from it. Marcus Carver. He was older than the file photos she'd reviewed, or maybe just harder, the way people got hard in fields that required it. He moved with confidence, not the confidence of someone who thought they were safe, but the confidence of someone who had accounted for the variables and believed his accounting was correct. He hadn't accounted for her. She stepped out from the armory corner. He saw her. He stopped. His 2 men came up on either side of him, and she had the SRS up, and she was looking at him over the scope at 40 meters in the full blaze of the compound lights. And for a second, just a second, neither of them moved. "Mia Torres," he said. His voice was what she'd expected. Controlled, almost academic. "Marcus Carver," she said. His left hand moved slightly, a signal to the men beside him. She saw it. "Don't," she said, and her voice came out flat and absolute in the way that her voice sometimes did, the way she'd been told it did, in moments when the voice came from somewhere that didn't have room for uncertainty. His hand stopped. "You're not going to shoot me," he said. "You're a journalist." "I was," she said. "You keep making people remind me of that." His eyes were very steady. He was looking at her the way she'd look at a problem, calculating distance, calculating options, calculating the fastest route to an outcome that worked for him. She could see him doing it. She'd been doing the same thing her entire life, and she recognized the machinery behind his eyes. "Put the rifle down," she said. "Hands where I can see them, both of you." The 2 men looked at Carver. Carver looked at her. And then, from behind her, from the shadows on the east side of the armory that she hadn't fully cleared, that she'd calculated as empty and calculated wrong, she heard a boot scrape on gravel. A 4th man. She hadn't seen a 4th. She had a split second to decide whether to hold Carver or turn for the 4th man, and she made the wrong choice, or the right one, depending on how you counted. She held on Carver, because Carver was the command element, and losing command broke the operation, and the fourth man hit her from the right side with enough force to take her off her feet. The rifle went one direction. She went another. She hit the gravel hard. Left shoulder, then her hip, rolling on instinct, putting distance between herself and the impact point. She came up on one knee and the fourth man was already closing, and she went to meet him rather than back away, because backing away in a 4-against-1 was how you died. She had 3 seconds of very close, very ugly work, the kind of fighting that didn't look like anything she'd trained for and looked exactly like everything she'd trained for. And then Walsh appeared from the gap between the armory and the comms building, and the situation changed. Walsh moved like a man who had been in 3 firefights and learned something from each one. He went for the near of Carver's 2 men, and the fight went sideways in the specific chaotic way that fights went when they stopped being individual engagements and became a general collision of people with incompatible intentions. She broke free of the fourth man, found the rifle on the gravel, came up with it. One of Carver's men was down. Walsh had him. The other was running, heading back toward the east gate. She tracked him and held, because the engagement behind her was still hot, and a running man heading back the way he'd come was a problem for Cross, not for her. Carver was gone. She spun. He'd moved in the 4 seconds of the collision. He wasn't at the east gate. He wasn't running. She found him at the entrance to the command building. He was inside. She ran. The command building was dark. The interior lights hadn't triggered the same way the compound floods had. She came through the door fast and low, rifle up, transitioning from the bright exterior to the dark interior in the specific blindness of that transition, the 2 seconds while your eyes adjusted. She heard him before she saw him. He was at the comms station. She heard the sound of hands on a keyboard, the specific sound of someone trying to transmit something fast. She crossed the room in 5 steps and put the barrel of the SRS against the back of his neck. He stopped typing. "Get up," she said. He got up slowly, hands away from his body. She could feel her heart rate, elevated, not controlled the way it had been on the ledge this morning, because this was different from the ledge. The ledge was geometry. This was something older than geometry. "You killed him," she said. "At cost." Carver turned his head slightly. Not enough to see her directly. "That's a complicated, say yes or no." A pause. "Yes." The room was very quiet. Through those walls, she could hear the compound noise, the main force engagement breaking down, rangers calling clear, the specific noise of a firefight ending in one direction. She stood behind Marcus Carver with the rifle at his neck and 3 years of misplaced guilt in her chest and the full shape of what had been done to her, to her teammate, to the mission it cost, finally visible and clear and present in a way it had never been when it was theory. Her hands were steady. She noticed that. She noticed it the way she'd noticed it this morning on the rock shelf, and yesterday on the approach road, and every time in the past 3 years when she'd stood in front of something difficult, and her hands had been steadier than the rest of her. She stepped back. "Hands behind your head," she said. "Walk to the door." He turned. He looked at her. Whatever he'd expected to see on her face, it wasn't what was there. She could tell that from the way his expression shifted, just slightly, the recalculation of a man whose model had been wrong. "Walk to the door," she said again. He walked. She followed. Outside, Cross was waiting. Cross was standing at the command building entrance with Hooper behind him, and 2 rangers flanking the door when Mia walked Carver out. He looked at Carver. He looked at Mia. He looked at the rifle in her hands, and the gravel dust on her left shoulder, and the way she was holding herself, upright, controlled, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent the last 4 minutes doing things they would need to think about later, and had decided that later was for later. He didn't say anything. He took Carver by the arm and handed him to the 2 rangers, and they moved him away from the building entrance with the efficient handling of men who'd done prisoner control before. Carver walked without resistance. He looked at Mia once, over his shoulder, as the rangers moved him. She didn't look away. He did. Hooper said, "South perimeter is clear. Main force element is down or detained. We've got 4 dead, 9 detained, 3 who went back over the wall before we closed it." "Let them go?" Cross said. "Couldn't hold the wall and close the breach at the same time. They're on foot, no vehicles on the outside, but they're not going anywhere useful." Cross nodded. He looked at Mia again. Walsh. He's fine. He's got a cut on his forearm that needs looking at. She paused. He won't admit it needs looking at. That's accurate for Walsh. Cross looked at the command building behind her. What did Carver try to transmit? I don't know. I stopped him before he finished. Your signals people should pull the partial log. Already on it. He studied her face for a moment. Are you injured? She thought about it honestly. Left shoulder from the gravel impact, which would be ugly by morning, but was functional now. A scrape on her right hand she'd gotten during the close work with the fourth man, and hadn't noticed until the adrenaline settled. Her ribs on the left side. She'd taken an elbow or a knee during the four-man collision, and breathing hurt in the specific directional way that suggested bruising rather than fracture. Nothing that needs immediate attention, she said. Cross looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the valley, the expression that said he was filing things rather than reacting to them. Get Okafor to check you over, and then I need you in the debrief room in 1 hour. Who's in the debrief? You, me, Hooper, and a man named Colonel Briggs who is currently on a helicopter from Bagram and is going to have significant questions about how a freelance photographer directed the tactical defense of one of my forward operating bases. She looked at him. How significant? He used the word unauthorized 4 times in a 2-minute phone call, Cross said. Make of that what you will. Okafor wrapped her ribs and cleaned the hand and told her the shoulder was going to color badly by morning and she should probably not sleep on that side. She told him she'd try. He looked at her with the practiced skepticism of a medic who had heard people say they'd try to take care of themselves and had subsequently watched them not take care of themselves, but he didn't push it. She used the 15 minutes before the debrief to sit in the medical bay and be still. She did the things she'd learned to do after operations. The mental accounting, the inventory. Not emotional processing, not yet, that came later and took longer. Just the immediate tally. What happened, in what order, what the outcomes were, what the gaps were, what she'd done right, and what she'd done wrong. The fourth man at the armory was in the wrong column. She'd cleared the East Gate approach and missed a flanking position. Walsh had covered it, but Walsh covering it wasn't the same as her not missing it. If Walsh hadn't been there, if Cross hadn't insisted on Walsh, which she'd argued against, she stopped that line of thought. The outcome was what it was. The error was noted. Move on. Coast was in a different column, not the operational column, the other one, the one she'd been building for 3 years without knowing she was building it. She sat with that for a while. The shape of it was this. She had believed for 3 years that her teammate's death was a consequence of her failure. That belief had been the architecture of everything she'd done since leaving the military, taking the camera, going to the places where war happened and documenting it instead of participating in it. The penance structure of a woman who thought she owed something she could never fully repay. And the belief was false. Not her failure, not her hesitation, not her read on the terrain. A targeted killing managed by a man who'd needed her teammate gone and had engineered a situation where the death would look like operational loss. Clean. Accounted for. Carried by the surviving team members as guilt rather than investigated as what it was. She thought about her teammate's name. She thought about his face, which she could still see clearly, which she suspected she would always be able to see clearly. She thought about what it meant that the thing she'd been carrying wasn't what she thought it was. It didn't make it lighter. That was the honest truth. The weight was the same. It had just shifted, moved from one place in her chest to a different place, a place that had a different quality. Not guilt. Something harder than guilt and cleaner. Something that would need to be addressed through official channels and legal processes and the long grinding machinery of military accountability that she had no faith in and was going to have to use anyway. She stood up, straightened her vest, picked up the rifle, and went to the debrief room. Colonel Briggs was a spare man in his late 50s with the weathered precision of someone who had spent a career being exactly as expressive as the situation required and not 1 degree more. He was sitting at the head of the table when she came in, with a legal pad in front of him and a pen he hadn't used yet. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at most things, carefully, without visible judgment, with the specific patience of someone who had decided to hear everything before deciding anything. Cross was at the table. Hooper was at the table. A woman she didn't know, Jag, by the look of the uniform and the way she was holding a separate notepad, sat in the corner. Mia sat across from Briggs. He looked at her press credential, which someone had placed on the table in front of him. He looked at her. Mia Torres. Yes, sir. Freelance journalist, Associated Press credentials, embedded authorization from Brigade. He looked at the credential again. This authorization covers observation and documentation. It does not cover tactical engagement. No, sir. You are aware that what you did in Ashen Valley today, and subsequently on this base tonight, falls significantly outside the scope of that authorization. Yes, sir. You're not going to argue about it? No, sir. He looked at her for a moment. Most people argue about it. I know what I did. Arguing about the authorization doesn't change what happened. She held his gaze. I do it again. Briggs wrote something on his legal pad. She couldn't see what. He set the pen down. Tell me about Coast, he said. She told him. She'd organized it on the walkover, the sequence, the evidence, the information from Reyes, the connection to Carver, the 3-year gap between the event and its true shape becoming clear. She told it the way she'd told Cross in his quarters the previous night, sequentially, without editorializing, with the personal parts folded in as operational context rather than emotional disclosure. Briggs listened. The JAG officer wrote. Cross and Hooper sat still. When she finished, Briggs was quiet for a moment. Victor Reyes, he said. Yes, sir. Who provided intelligence on the second phase attack and on the inside asset. Yes, sir. Who was present at the ambush in a contracted capacity on the opposing side. Yes, sir. And who you allowed to leave the North Ridge without detention. Yes, sir. Briggs looked at her. That's going to be a problem for some people. I know. Is it going to be a problem for you? She thought about it, honestly. Reyes gave us everything that allowed us to stop the second phase. Without his intelligence, the FOB gets hit blind and we lose the comms building at minimum, probably worse. She paused. Detaining him in the valley would have put him in the legal system in a way that would have made him unwilling or unable to provide the information he provided. The trade was necessary. That's a calculation you made unilaterally. Yes, sir. Without military authority, without authorization from Captain Cross, without consulting anyone. There wasn't time to consult anyone, sir, and I was the only person on that ridge who knew who he was. Briggs wrote something else. And who he was to you. The room was very quiet. Yes, she said. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cross. Captain, sir, your assessment of Ms. Torres's actions in the valley and on this base, unvarnished. Cross considered it. She watched him consider it. Not performing consideration, actually doing it, which she appreciated. She identified the threat indicators on the approach road before contact. She picked up Kavanaugh's rifle when Kavanaugh went down, and she managed the high ground threat in a way that preserved the team's ability to hold the valley floor. Her tactical advice during the engagement was sound, and I followed it. He paused. Tonight she identified the inside asset, developed the deception plan for the Riley transmission, laid out the defensive positioning for the breach response, and located Carver's personal entry point before anyone else had accounted for it. Another pause. She also missed a flanker at the armory. I noted that, Mia said. Cross looked at her briefly. She noted it herself. He looked back at Briggs. My assessment is that without Ms. Torres, the convoy doesn't make it back from the valley, and the phobie gets hit tonight without warning, without a defensive plan, and with the inside asset still in place. He held Briggs's eyes. That's my unvarnished assessment, sir. Briggs let that sit. The JAG officer had stopped writing. Mia noticed that. She wasn't sure what it meant. Briggs said, Ms. Torres, before you separated from the military, you were a designated precision marksman, special operations support, attached to a task force whose name I'm not going to say in this room. Yes, sir. Your separation was voluntary. You cited personal reasons and the paperwork reflects an honorable discharge with no adverse action. Yes, sir. But you didn't tell anyone the real reason. She looked at him. I didn't know the real reason, sir. Not until last night. She held his eyes. I thought I'd made an error that killed my teammate. I couldn't continue in that capacity under that belief. And now I know the error wasn't mine. She paused. That doesn't uncomplicate anything, but it changes the shape of it. Briggs was quiet. He looked at his legal pad. He looked at her press credential on the table. He picked up the pen and then set it back down. Carver is in custody, he said. The legal process for what he did at Coast, that's going to take time. It's going to take a formal investigation, witness statements, evidence development. It's going to take longer than you want it to take, and it's going to be handled by people you don't know and some of whom you won't trust. He looked at her steadily. That's the part you don't control. You understand that? Yes, sir. Can you live with that? She thought about it. I can work with that, she said. Living with it is a different conversation. Something crossed Briggs's face. It was brief and she couldn't read it precisely. Not sympathy, something more operational than sympathy. Acknowledgement, maybe. The look of a man who understood the difference between a problem that was solved and a problem that was processed. Reyes, he said. The 72-hour window. Closed in 48 hours from last contact. We have 48 hours to bring him in voluntarily before that option closes. He won't come in voluntarily to a standard process. She said it flat. He knows what the standard process looks like for someone in his position. He'll disappear. Then what do you suggest? She looked at him. Let me talk to him. Briggs held her eyes. The JAG officer had her pen down too now. Cross was watching her with the expression he'd worn on and off since the valley. That particular look of a man who kept updating his picture of her and kept finding it larger than the previous version. Through the frequency he gave you, Briggs said. Yes, sir. Which you will do under our supervision, with a recorder on the line. Yes, sir. And if he agrees to come in, then he comes in and you get a witness to Cost with 6 years of operational knowledge of Carver's network. She paused. That's worth more than the charges against Reyes, sir, which I assume you're capable of calculating. Briggs looked at her for a long time. Captain Cross, he said without looking away from her. Sir, Ms. Torres is going to need a temporary authorization. Something that lets her operate on this base in an official capacity without me having to write 17 memos explaining why a journalist is sitting in my debrief rooms. He picked up the pen. Consult with JAG on the cleanest mechanism. I want it on paper before morning. The JAG officer wrote something rapidly. Ms. Torres, Briggs said. Sir? The Reyes contact happens at 0600 with supervision. He looked at her. Between now and then, you will sleep. That is not a suggestion. Understood, sir. And Ms. Torres. He said it a third time with a slightly different quality. She waited. What you did in the valley and on this base tonight. The official record is going to reflect that as a complicated situation involving an embedded civilian who exceeded her authorization under extraordinary circumstances. He paused. The unofficial record, which is the one that matters to the people in this room, reflects something different. She didn't say anything. Dismissed, he said. She slept for 4 hours. She didn't expect to sleep that quickly or that solidly, but her body made the decision without consulting her and she went under hard and didn't surface until Cross knocked on the media tent frame at 0530. She woke with the complete immediate alertness that had been trained into her and then spent 3 years going to waste and was apparently still there. 45 minutes, Cross said. She sat up. Her ribs reminded her about the previous night. Her shoulder agreed. She did the inventory. Functional, operational, uncomfortable. Walsh's arm, she said. 7 stitches. He complained about the local anesthetic more than the stitches. That's accurate for Walsh. She got up, dressed, went to the DFAC for coffee that tasted like it had been made from materials that had given up. She drank it standing because sitting felt wrong, and she looked at the base around her, the morning light coming over the eastern ridge, the compound still carrying the aftermath of the previous night in small ways, a scorch mark near the south perimeter, a section of gravel raked clean where something had needed to be cleaned, rangers moving with the specific purposeful quiet of people who had been in a fight and were now in the part that came after. Walsh found her at the coffee station. He looked at her arm in the sling, then at her. 7 stitches, he said before she could ask. Ask? Cross told me. He tell you I complained about the anesthetic? Yes. Walsh poured coffee. It was a lot of anesthetic, he said. Okafor's heavy-handed. He drank. How are your ribs? They've been better. The shoulder? Also. He nodded. He looked at his cup. Carver, he said. In custody. The guys from last night. 4 dead, 9 detained, 3 who got back over the wall. Walsh was quiet for a moment. You knew Carver was coming in through the east gate, he said, before it happened. You left the south perimeter and went east. Yes. How did you know? She thought about how to answer that, not because she was hiding it, but because the honest answer was complicated in a way that was hard to compress. Because I know how people like Carver think, she said finally, and I know how I would have moved if I were him. Walsh absorbed that. You would have gone in through the east gate. Yes. With 3 people instead of with the assault element. Yes. He was quiet again. Then he said, You know what the guys are calling you. I can guess. 11, he said. From the valley. Just 11. He looked at her sideways. I know you probably don't want a nickname. I've had worse. He almost smiled. Yeah? He looked at the eastern ridge, where the light was coming in full now. The first real warmth of the morning touching the top of the sandbag walls. What was it like, he said. Before. When you were doing this. When it was your job. She thought about that. Different, she said. And the same. She looked at the compound. The geometry is always the same. The math doesn't change. Distance, wind, elevation, timing. She paused. What changes is what you're carrying when you do it. What were you carrying this time? She looked at him. He was watching her with the honest, slightly uncomfortable curiosity of a young man who wanted to understand something that wasn't entirely understandable and knew it. Less than I thought I was, she said, and more than I knew. He nodded slowly, like that made a kind of sense he'd work out later. The contact with Reyes happened at 0600 in the comms room, with Briggs and Cross present and a signals warrant officer running the recorder. The JAG officer sat in the corner with her notepad. Mia keyed the frequency, gave the challenge sequence, 11 seconds of static. You're not alone on the line, Reyes said, not accusatory, just noting it. No. Colonel level, by the sound of the room. Yes. A pause. Carver's in custody. Yes. Last night went the way you planned it. Mostly. Another pause, longer. She waited. Who's the colonel? Reyes said. Briggs leaned forward. Colonel Daniel Briggs, 75th Ranger Regiment Support Command. Mr. Reyes, I'd like you to come in. Silence for a moment. Come in, Reyes said. That's a phrase that covers a lot of different outcomes. The outcome we're discussing, Briggs said, is one where you provide a full witness account of the Coast operation and Marcus Carver's role in it, and of Carver's network and operational history as you know it. In exchange, we discuss a framework for your situation that isn't a standard hostile contractor processing. A framework, Reyes said. He said it the way you repeated a word you found interesting. What kind of framework? The kind that requires your cooperation to build. Briggs paused. I can't promise you outcomes I haven't cleared with people above my authority. I can promise you that what you've provided in the last 24 hours has weight, and that weight has to go somewhere in the calculation. Silence. Mia said, Reyes. Yeah. The Coast investigation. They need you to make it real. Without your account, Carver's lawyers build a wall around it, and the case takes years and maybe goes nowhere. She paused. You know what he did? You told me. You've known for 6 months, and you built a 6-month plan to get the information to someone who could use it. She looked at the recorder, then at the wall, then at nothing. Come in and finish what you started. The static breathed. Where? Reyes said. Briggs gave him a location, a forward support point 3 hours from the ridge area, accessible, away from the main Bagram processing infrastructure. The kind of location that said, this is a conversation rather than this is an arrest. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Mia, he said. Yeah. You're going to have to write about this eventually, the Coast thing, what Carver did. I know. You going to be able to do that? She thought about her camera, cracked in the valley. She thought about the images on the card she hadn't pulled yet. The terrain shots, the ridge lines, the gap in the western cliff face that had mattered. Yeah, she said. That's why I came back. Another pause. Okay, he said. And for the first time in 3 years, she heard something in his voice that sounded like relief. Not happiness. Relief. The specific exhale of someone who had been holding a long breath and had just been given permission to let it go. 1200, he said. The location you gave me. I'll come in on foot. We'll have someone at the perimeter, Briggs said. Make sure it's someone I can see from a distance, Reyes said. Not a reception committee. Understood. The line went to static. Beck. Briggs left the comms room and took the JAG officer and the signals warrant with him. That left Mia and Cross alone in the room, with the recorder still running its quiet hiss. Cross reached over and turned it off. He'll show, she said. I think so too. Cross leaned back in his chair. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen on him before. Not operationally tired, the deeper kind. The kind that came from 2 days of compressing too many things into too small a space. Briggs is going to want a formal statement from you on the Valley, and last night. Everything, start to finish. I know. It's going to be long. I know. And after that, he said carefully, there's the question of what you're doing here. She looked at him. I'm an embedded journalist. You were an embedded journalist. He held her eyes. The credential covers observation. What you've been doing for the last 36 hours is something else. Are you asking me to leave? I'm asking you what you want. He said it simply. That's a different question. She sat with that. What she wanted was something she hadn't asked herself clearly in 3 years. Not since she'd walked out of the separation office and decided that what she wanted was to stop being what she'd been, and that documentation was a form of penance that felt workable. She'd wanted to tell stories. She'd wanted to make the cost of war visible in a way that her previous work had never allowed. She still wanted that. But sitting in this comms room with Cross across from her and Reyes on his way in from the ridge, and Carver in custody and Riley somewhere being processed by people who would eventually get to his daughter's protection arrangement, the shape of what she wanted had shifted slightly, clarified. I want to write the Coast story, she said. Everything that happened here feeds into it, but the story is Coast. What Carver did, why it happened, what it cost. She paused. I want to write it accurately, which means I need access to the investigation as it develops. That requires a relationship with this command that a standard press credential doesn't cover. Cross was quiet. I'm not asking to pick up a rifle again, she said. That's not what I'm looking for here. I know it's not. But the access, I'll talk to Briggs. He looked at her. It's not a no. I want to be clear about that. He paused. It's also not a simple yes, because nothing about your situation is simple, and everyone in this room understands that. Yes, she said. You should also probably get a new camera. She looked at him. He said it completely straight, which made it land differently than if he'd been trying to lighten the moment. The card is intact, she said. The images are intact. Good images. She thought about the terrain shots, the cliff faces, the gap in the western ridge she'd spotted before the ambush, and hadn't known yet that she'd spotted for a reason. Some of them are good, she said. Some of them are something else. He nodded. He stood, picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. I'm going to get Hooper and start the formal statements. An hour? An hour, she said. He went to the door, stopped. Torres. She looked up. The thing you said to Reyes, about why you came back. He looked at her steadily. You came back to write the story, or you came back because you hadn't figured out yet that you were coming back for something else? She looked at him for a long moment. I'm not sure those are different things, she said. He held her gaze for a second, then he nodded once and walked out. The formal statements took 4 hours. She sat in the debrief room with Briggs and the JAG officer and a court reporter who had arrived from Bagram with Briggs's support staff, and she told the full sequence, from the approach road, through the valley, through the ridge, through the night, through the command building. She answered every question. She didn't qualify anything she didn't need to qualify, and she didn't omit anything that was relevant. The coast section took the longest, not because it was operationally complex, but because the JAG officer asked precise questions and precision required time, and because some of the answers required Mia to say things out loud that she had previously only said inside her own head, and saying them out loud was a different experience than thinking them. She got through it. Halfway through the afternoon, Hooper knocked on the debrief room door and said quietly to Cross that Reyes had arrived at the forward support point. Cross looked at Briggs. Briggs nodded. Cross left. He came back 2 hours later. Mia was finishing her statement. Cross sat down at the table and waited for her to finish, and when she did, he said, He's talking. She nodded. Full cooperation. He gave the JAG team 3 hours of preliminary account. Cross looked at the table. The coast operation details. He had documents, physical documents he'd been keeping for 6 months. The JAG officer stopped writing. She looked up. Paper, Reyes had said on the ridge. I needed to talk to you without channels that could be monitored. He'd been building a paper record. Handwritten, physical. The one form of documentation that didn't have a network signature. The case is real, Briggs said. He said it quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. With his testimony and the documents, the case against Carver is real. The room was quiet. Mia looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon light was coming down long and flat across the compound. The way light came in late afternoon at this altitude, gold-edged, clear, making ordinary things look briefly significant. She thought about her teammate. She thought about his name, which she didn't say out loud, which she carried the way you carried the names of people you'd lost, close and private and not for display. She thought about 3 years of carrying a guilt that belonged to someone else, about what it cost to carry something that heavy for that long, about whether the cost could be accounted for or whether some things just got absorbed into the structure of who you were. She thought about Reyes sitting in a forward support point 3 hours from here, talking to JAG officers with his 6 months of handwritten documentation, doing the thing he'd built a 6-month plan to do, the thing he hadn't been able to do without her walking into the right convoy at the right moment and the mathematics of the valley making everything else necessary. She wasn't sure she believed in the kind of coincidence that explained how she'd ended up embedded with Ranger Team 412 on the specific convoy that Carver had targeted. She'd have to think about that later, when she had time to think about things that didn't have tactical urgency. Walsh knocked on the debrief room door. "Colonel," he said to Briggs, "sorry to interrupt. The guys wanted to... We were wondering if Ms. Torres had a minute." Briggs looked at Mia. "We're done for today," he said. She followed Walsh out. The team was in the motor pool. Not an official formation. They were sitting on the vehicle bumpers and the ground and a couple of the supply crates that Hooper had stacked near the recovery vehicle, in the easy, informal arrangement of men who were off the clock but not ready to disperse. Kavanaugh was there, with a bandage above his left ear and the slightly unfocused look of someone who'd been handed pain medication he was choosing to take seriously. Garrett had his arm in a proper sling now, the field sling replaced by something Okafor had fitted properly. The others were there too, the full team, minus Riley, who was somewhere in a process she didn't have visibility into and didn't need right now. They looked at her when she came around the corner. Nobody said anything for a moment, then Kavanaugh said, from his position on the supply crate, "You kept my rifle clean, I'll say that for you." "I cleaned it before I used it," she said. "Old habit." "Good habit." He paused. "I counted 14 rounds through the magazine I left staged. You used 11 in the valley and ran dry." "Yes." "And then you got up to the shelf." "Yes." "With 1 round." "I had the mag Cross gave me. After you'd already put down 6 people with 11 rounds." Kavanaugh looked at her steadily. The bandage above his ear was slightly crooked and nobody had fixed it. "I've been shooting for 8 years. Competitively for 3 of those." He paused. "I couldn't have done what you did with my rifle today." The motor pool was quiet. She didn't know what to do with that. She wasn't built for this kind of moment, the acknowledgement, the witnessing. She'd spent 3 years specifically avoiding this kind of moment, which was part of why she'd chosen work that kept her behind the camera rather than in front of any kind of recognition. "You would have," she said, "under the same conditions." "Maybe," Kavanaugh said. "Maybe not." He reached beside him on the crate and picked something up. He held it out. "Walsh's idea. We all agreed to it." It was a patch. Ranger tab shape, olive drab background, the number 11 in clean block figures. Below the number, in smaller text, Ashen Valley. She looked at it. "We're not giving you a tab you didn't earn through the pipeline," Walsh said from somewhere to her left. "That's not what this is. It's just what happened. Documented." He paused. 11 shots. That happened. She took the patch. It was the size of her palm. The stitching was clean and she thought someone had made it quickly with whatever the base had available, and the care showed in the fact that it didn't look quick. She looked at the faces around the motor pool. These were the men she'd directed and protected and fought beside and asked to trust her before she'd given them any particular reason to. These were the men who'd watched her work and then waited to see what she was, and had decided to tell her what they'd concluded by showing up in a motor pool at the end of a very long 2 days and handing her a patch with a number on it. Her throat tightened. She let it tighten, and she didn't do anything about it. "Thank you," she said. She said it quietly, without performance, to the room. Walsh said, 11, and something in his voice made it not a nickname, but a record, a fact about what had happened in a valley 2 days ago. 11, a couple of the others said. Not mockingly, not with fanfare, just the number, just the fact of it. Garrett said, from his spot against the vehicle, with his proper sling. "So what happens now? You going back out?" She looked at the patch in her hand. She looked at the base around her, the sandbag walls, the comm arrays, the gap in the south perimeter that was already being properly reinforced. She looked at the eastern ridge where the morning light had come in and where the Apaches had made their slow circle, and where, somewhere on the north face, Reyes had walked away with 6 months of handwritten paper and a plan that had finally reached its conclusion. "I'm going to need a camera," she said. Walsh laughed. It was the first real laugh she'd heard from him. Not the performance in the DFAC the first night. Not the tension break laugh of the valley. A real one. Garrett joined it. Even Kavanaugh, with his bandage crooked and his pain medication doing its work, made a sound that was in the general vicinity of laughter. The afternoon light came through the motor pool entrance and lay across the gravel floor, and she stood in the middle of it holding an 11-stitch patch and feeling, for the first time in 3 years, that the ground under her had a quality she recognized. Not steady, not simple, but real. The camera arrived 3 days later. Cross had ordered it through the base supply chain with the specific bureaucratic determination of a man who had decided something was going to happen and was willing to fill out whatever form stood between him and that outcome. It was a Nikon, not the model she'd lost in the valley, but close enough, a professional body with a 24-70 zoom that someone at Supply had paired with it, possibly because it was what they had. Possibly because someone had actually thought about what a war photographer needed in terms of focal range. She held it for a moment before she turned it on. Just the weight of it, the familiar geometry of the grip. Then she turned it on, checked the settings, and went to work. The base had a different quality in the days after the Phobie assault. Not quieter. If anything, there was more activity, more personnel moving through, more vehicles, the increased presence of people from higher commands who needed to see the location of a thing that had happened and ask questions about it in person. But underneath the increased activity, the base had the specific texture of a place where something had been resolved. The kind of texture that came not from things going well, but from things being finished. The difference between a wound healing and a wound that was still open. She documented it. That was what she did. She photographed the south perimeter reinforcement, the timber patch being replaced with proper sandbag construction, a sergeant she didn't know supervising 2 privates who were doing the work with the methodical care of men who understood why it mattered now in a way they might not have understood a week ago. She photographed the debrief convoys coming and going. She photographed Kavanaugh doing physical therapy exercises in the courtyard outside the medical bay, his bandage finally straight, his expression the concentrated frown of someone trying to do something his body wasn't cooperating with. He saw her and said, "Don't put that in anything," and she said, "Too late," and he shook his head and kept doing the exercises. She photographed the valley. She went back with Hooper on a route clearance run, legitimate convoy, proper authorization, the new press credential that Briggs's JAG officer had constructed covering observation and documentation in a way that was more honest about what she actually did. Hooper drove and she rode in the passenger seat with the camera on her lap, and she shot the valley from inside the vehicle, the cliff walls and the road, and the places where the fighting had happened, which were now just places, gravel and rock and dust, with no particular quality that would tell a stranger what they'd been. That was the thing about places where violence happened. They didn't look like what they'd been. They just looked like geography. She shot it anyway. The absence was part of the story. Briggs left Black Ridge on the 4th day with Carver in custody transport and a preliminary investigation file that the JAG officer had described as substantial. Mia had been present for part of the Carver processing, the formal charging, the documentation of the Coast case structure. and she'd sat in the back of the room with her notepad rather than her camera, writing in the longhand she used when she was being a journalist rather than a photographer, taking notes she'd need later. Carver had said nothing through the formal processing. He'd sat with his hands folded on the table and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had lawyers in mind and was saving everything for them. She'd watched him from across the room and tried to identify what she felt about it, about seeing him reduced to paperwork, to a file number, to a process. She felt mostly tired. Not the tiredness of disappointment. She'd understood that the paperwork was what justice looked like from the inside, that it was unglamorous and slow and dependent on people she didn't know, doing their jobs correctly over a period of time she couldn't control. She'd understood that going in. She was tired the way you were tired after carrying something heavy for a long time and then setting it down. The muscles remembered the weight even after the weight was gone. Briggs stopped at her chair on his way out of the processing room. "The investigation will take time," he said. "I know. Carver's attorneys will contest the Coast evidence." "I know." "Reyes's testimony is the keystone. If they break his credibility—" "They won't," she said. "He has documents, paper documents he kept for 6 months specifically because he knew testimony alone could be challenged." She looked up at Briggs. "He anticipated this. He's been anticipating it longer than any of us." Briggs studied her for a moment. "His processing framework," he said. "We found a mechanism that works. Cooperation agreement. He'll testify fully on the Coast case and provide complete intelligence on Carver's network. In exchange, the contracted combatant charges go to a disposition that doesn't close every door." "What does that mean for him?" "It means he has options that don't involve a cell." Briggs paused. "What he does with those options is his business." She nodded. "Ms. Torres." He said it the way he'd said it in the debrief, with the slightly different weight of a man who was choosing to say something he hadn't decided ahead of time. "The Coast story, when you write it." "Yes, sir." "Write it accurately. All of it. The institutional failures, not just the individual one." He held her eyes. "Carver didn't build what he built without structures that allowed it. Those structures should be visible in the record." She looked at him. It was, she thought, the most important thing anyone with his rank had said to her in a long time. "Yes, sir," she said. He left. On the 5th day, she found Reyes. He was at the forward support point, still technically in the cooperation framework. Not detained, not free, in the specific bureaucratic middle ground of someone whose status was being negotiated by people with legal pads. She'd requested the visit through Cross, who'd requested it through Briggs's office, and it had taken 2 days to come back approved, which was faster than she'd expected. He was sitting in a folding chair outside the main building when she arrived, in the afternoon light, looking at the mountains the way people looked at things they were trying to fix in memory before they moved on from them. He heard her coming and didn't turn until she was 10 feet away. Then he looked at her. She sat in the other folding chair, the one she assumed had been put there for this purpose, and they looked at the mountains together for a moment without saying anything. "How are you?" she said. "Tired," he said. "You?" "Same." He looked at her camera. "You're back to it." "Yes." "Good camera?" "Different from the one I lost." "It'll work?" He nodded. He looked at his hands in his lap, then back at the mountains. He'd lost some of the controlled qualities she'd seen on the ridge. Not worse, just different. Like a tension that had been necessary for a long time had released and left something quieter in its place. "The documents," she said. "You kept them for 6 months." "8, actually. I started collecting before I knew what I was going to do with them." He paused. "I think I knew. I just hadn't said it to myself yet." "Why didn't you come to me earlier?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't know if you'd come back," he said. "You were gone, and I knew why you were gone, and I wasn't sure that pulling you back into it was something I had the right to do." He paused. "And then you showed up on a convoy manifest, and the decision got made for me. By Carver. By the situation." He looked at her. "I don't know if I'm going to say I'm sorry for the way it happened. The valley was... I delayed the northeast element. I gave you what I could. I know. But people got hurt." "Yes." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry for that part." She thought about Kavanaugh with his crooked bandage, doing physical therapy in the courtyard. Garrett's arm. The 4 rangers who'd come off the mission carrying things in their bodies that would need time. "I know you are," she said. "I believe that. Does it help?" "Not particularly," she said, "but it's still true." He almost smiled. It looked like something he hadn't done in a while and had to remember the muscle for. "That's fair," he said. They sat for a while in the folding chairs and let the mountains be the mountains. The afternoon light was moving across the peaks the way it did at this latitude, slowly, the shadows lengthening from east to west in a geological indifference to everything happening at their feet. "What are you going to do?" she said. "After the cooperation framework resolves." "I don't know yet." He said it simply, without the defensive packaging people usually put around not knowing. "I've been working toward one thing for 8 months. I'm not good at planning past single points." He paused. "What about you?" "Write the story," she said. "The real one. Coast, Carver, what the structure looked like from the inside." She paused. "It'll take time. Investigation is still developing. I'll need to wait for things I can't yet publish. I'll need sources to go on record." "I'll go on record." She looked at him. "For the story," he said. "When it's ready and the legal process is far enough along, I'll go on record." He held her eyes. "It needs to be told in a way that people can read it, not just in a legal file." She thought about Briggs saying write it accurately, all of it. "It will be," she said. He nodded. He looked back at the mountains. "Mia," he said. "Yeah." "The night at Chaos, what you carried from it." He paused carefully. "You know it wasn't yours." "I know," she said, "but you're still going to carry something." "Yes." She looked at the mountain line. "That's different from what I was carrying before. Different weight. Different—" She stopped. "I don't have the right word for it." "You don't need the right word for it," he said. They sat until the light changed. She left Black Ridge on the 7th day. The helicopter that came for her was a logistics run, not a ceremonial departure, not a formal send-off, just a Chinook with cargo space that was going the direction she needed to go and had room for 1 passenger with a camera bag and a pack. She liked that. It was the same way she'd arrived, and there was something in the symmetry of it that felt accurate. The team was in the motor pool when she said goodbye, which was where she'd started to think of them as being, in the motor pool with the afternoon light coming through the entrance and the smell of diesel and dust, and the specific comfort of men who occupied a space so regularly it took on the shape of them. Kavanaugh shook her hand. His grip was careful. He was protecting something in his shoulder that he hadn't mentioned to Okafor. She could tell, and she didn't mention that she could tell. "Safe travels," he said. "Send a story when it's published." "I will." Garrett said, "Don't go to any more valleys," and she said, "I'll try." And they both understood that was not a promise anyone in their line of work could actually make. The other said things she committed to memory because she didn't want to write them down, because writing them down felt like making them into material rather than letting them be what they were, which was just men saying goodbye to someone in the way that people said goodbye when the thing that had connected them was real and the goodbye meant something. Walsh walked her to the helicopter. He carried her pack for the first 30 feet until she took it back, and he let her take it back, which was the right call, and she noticed it. At the landing zone, the Chinook was already spooling up, the rotors beginning their slow revolution, the crew chief doing his external checks. She had 2 minutes. "The story," Walsh said, "when it comes out." "Yes." "Our names in it?" "If you authorize it." He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, put it in. Put all of it in." He looked at the helicopter, then back at her. "People should know what happened out there." "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the flat Texas honesty that she'd come to understand was not simplicity, but a choice, a decision to say the real thing rather than the easier thing. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "What?" "You were going to leave. You were going to get on the original helicopter, go back to Bagram, write something about the humanitarian convoy and move on to the next thing." He paused. "And instead you ended up in the valley and everything after came from that." "Yes." "That doesn't bother you?" How close it was to being completely different. She thought about it honestly, about the specific randomness of how she'd ended up on that manifest, in that convoy, in the valley, on that particular morning. About what Reyes had said. "The decision got made for me." about the way contingency and intention got tangled in the field until you couldn't separate them cleanly. Everything's close to being completely different, she said. That's true all the time. Most of the time you don't know it. Walsh nodded slowly. 11, he said. Not a nickname anymore. A conclusion. She picked up her bag and walked to the helicopter. What? From the air, the valley was a different thing. She was on the right side of the Chinook, at the porthole, and the route took them over the eastern ridge and then across the broad terrain south of Ashen Valley. And from altitude she could see the valley opening, the road through the cliff walls, the shape of the kill zone from above, the natural ledge where she'd lain and worked the scope. She raised the camera. She shot it. Not because it would be a great photograph from this altitude, in this light. It was just terrain, just geography, not different from the 1,000 other pieces of Afghan highland that looked exactly like this from the air. But she shot it anyway because she needed the record of having seen it from outside, from the distance that changes the shape of things. The valley fell behind the helicopter's tail. She lowered the camera and looked forward, at the mountains coming, at the country opening ahead. She thought about the story she was going to write. Not the photographs, the words, the long-form account that she'd been building in her head since the valley, and that would take months to finish properly and would be harder to write than anything she'd written before because it was hers in a way that most stories weren't. It was about her teammate and what had been done to him in the 3-year architecture of a guilt that had been installed in her by a man who needed her to carry it. It was about what institutions did with the costs they couldn't account for on the official ledger. It was about a lot of things. She'd figure out which things on the page. That was what the page was for. Her ribs ached on the left side where the bruising had gone purple and spectacular overnight. Her shoulder was still stiff. The scrape on her right hand had scabbed in a way that pulled when she gripped the camera, which she was going to have to manage. The 11-stitch patch was in the inside pocket of her vest, against her ribs, on the side that didn't hurt. She felt it there. The slight rigidity of the stitched backing. The small weight of a thing that had been made quickly and with care by people who had decided that what happened in Ashen Valley needed to be marked, not explained. She thought about what Cross had said in the comms room. You came back to write the story, or you came back because you hadn't figured out yet that you were coming back for something else. She told him she wasn't sure those were different things. She still thought that was true. But sitting in the Chinook with the mountains coming and the valley behind her and the full weight of the week settling into her body with all its bruising and ache and strange, hard-won clarity, she thought she understood it slightly better than she had when she'd said it. She'd come back to document the cost of war. That was what she'd told herself. That she could do more with a camera than she could with a rifle. That bearing witness was a form of action. That the world needed people who could look at what happened and say this happened, and it mattered. She still believed all of that. She believed it more completely than she had before, in the way that you believed things more completely after they'd been tested. But she'd also come back because the part of her that had been trained for the geometry of difficult situations, the reading of terrain, the calculation of threat, the precise and terrible decision-making of someone who had been taught to look at a problem and find the angle that solved it. That part hadn't gone anywhere. It had been there all along, underneath the camera bag and the press credential, waiting with the patience of something that understood it was fundamental rather than incidental. She wasn't going to pick up a rifle again. That wasn't the conclusion. She'd looked at the question directly, in the valley, and on the shelf, and in the command building with the barrel at Carver's neck, and the conclusion was the same one she'd come to before. She was done with that specific form of it. But the skills weren't the problem. Cross had said that in the motor pool, and she'd heard it as comfort at the time. It was more than that. It was accurate. What you did with the skills was the whole question. She looked out the porthole at the country below, at the roads and the villages and the mountains and the specific quality of light at altitude, which was cleaner and harder than light at lower elevations, without the haze that softened edges. She'd spent 3 years in places like this, documenting things that needed documenting, and she was going to spend more years doing the same, and the difference between who she'd been when she started and who she was now was not something she could summarize cleanly or would want to. She raised the camera. She shot the mountains. She was still shooting when the valley was long gone and Bagram appeared ahead, and she kept shooting because that was what she did now, what she'd chosen to do with the thing inside her that was always looking for the angle. Not the angle that ended things, but the angle that made them visible. That was the work. She kept doing it. The Coast investigation took 14 months. Carver was formally charged in the 11th month, with trial proceedings beginning 4 months after that. Reyes testified for 3 days. His account, combined with the physical documentation he'd maintained, was described by the military legal team as the most complete evidentiary record they'd seen in a case of its type. Mia published the story in the 15th month. It ran long, longer than most publications would accept, but the publication that took it understood what it was. It was read by people who needed to read it and by people who didn't know they needed to read it until they had. It won things she didn't care much about and started conversations she cared about considerably more. She was on assignment in a different country when the verdict came in. Cross sent her a single message. It held. She read it standing outside a vehicle on a road in a place that looked different from Afghanistan, but had the same quality of sky, high and clear and indifferent to everything beneath it. She wrote back, "Good." She put her phone in her pocket, raised her camera, and kept going. Some people spent their whole lives running from what they were good at. Some people never stopped to ask why they were running, or what they were running toward, or whether the thing they left behind was actually the burden they thought it was, or the ground they were always meant to come back to. The person you run from is not always the person you should leave behind. Sometimes, in the right moment, in the right valley, with the right stakes and the right weight in your hands, the person you've been running from is the only person in